The scream came from the village square before the sun had even finished rising, and Elira Voss dropped the basket of herbs she was carrying the moment she heard it. Her hands went cold. She knew that scream. It was the scream of a name being called, and in Blackmore Ridge, there was only one call that made grown men weep and mothers fall to their knees. The selection bell had rung at dawn, 3 days earlier than anyone expected, and now the herald stood on the wooden platform at the center of the square, holding a scroll sealed with black wax. Elira pushed through the gathering crowd, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She told herself it could not be her. She was nobody. Her family held no rank, no wealth, no favor with the ruling packs. She was an omega from the poorest edge of the territory, the daughter of a woodcutter and a seamstress, a girl who had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. Being noticed in Blackmore Ridge was dangerous. Being noticed by the crown was worse. The herald unrolled the scroll. His voice was flat, practiced, the voice of a man who had delivered this same sentence 9 times before and had learned not to let his face show what he felt about it. By order of the throne of Blackmore Ridge, the 10th selection is complete. The name chosen to stand as bride to His Majesty, Alpha King Cale Draven, is Elira Voss, daughter of Edwin and Marion Voss, of the Eastern Hollow. For a moment, the world went silent. Elira felt the crowd turn toward her all at once, hundreds of eyes finding her face, and she understood, with a sickness rising in her stomach, that every single one of those people was thinking the same thing. 9 brides, 9 graves, and now a 10th name had been drawn, and it was hers. Someone screamed again, but this time it was her mother, pushing through the crowd with her hands pressed to her mouth. Marion Voss reached her daughter and grabbed her by the shoulders, as if she could physically hold her back from a fate that had already been sealed in wax, and read aloud in front of the entire village. "No," Marion said, her voice breaking. "No, there has to be a mistake. She is 17. She has not even come of age in the registry yet." The herald did not look up from his scroll. "The registry lists her as eligible. The selection is final. She will be collected at midday tomorrow." Elira's father arrived a moment later, and he did not shout or argue the way her mother did. He simply stood there, his face gray, his hands hanging useless at his sides, and Elira understood that this was somehow worse than her mother's panic. Her father had grown up in Blackmore Ridge his whole life. He had watched, from a careful distance, as 9 other families lost their daughters to the same scroll, the same wax seal, the same flat voice reading a name in the square. He knew there was nothing anyone could do. That night, the house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Elira sat by the small fire with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to her parents argue in whispers in the next room, though it was not really an argument. It was her mother begging and her father saying, again and again, that there was no way out, that refusing the selection meant death not just for Elira, but for the whole family, that the throne did not forgive defiance. Her younger sister, Nora, crawled into the room and sat beside her without saying anything for a long time. Nora was only 12, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to know that something terrible had landed on their family like a stone dropped from a great height. "Will you die like the others?" Nora finally asked, her voice so small it almost disappeared into the crackle of the fire. Elira did not answer right away. She thought about lying, about telling her sister that everything would be fine, that the stories about the 9 brides were probably exaggerated by frightened villagers who liked to whisper about things they did not understand. But she had grown up on those same whispers, and she knew, deep down, that they were not exaggerations. "I don't know," Elira said honestly, because she had never been able to lie to Nora, not even to protect her. "But I am not going to just accept it without understanding what happened to them first." That decision, made quietly in the dark beside a dying fire, would change everything that came after. The next morning, before the royal carriage was due to arrive, Elira went to see the one person in the village who might know the truth behind the whispers. Old Greta had once served in the Black Citadel itself, decades ago, before she retired to the village to live out her final years away from the court. She rarely spoke of her time there, and most villagers assumed she simply did not like to remember it. Elira had always assumed the same thing. Now she needed to know why. She found Greta sitting outside her small stone cottage, mending a torn shawl, her white hair pulled back in a tight knot. When Elira approached, the old woman did not look surprised. She simply set down her needle and folded her hands in her lap, as though she had been waiting for this visit for years. "You are the 10th, Greta said. It was not a question. "I am," Elira said. "I need to know what happened to the others. All of them, please." "I don't have much time." Greta studied her for a long moment, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Everyone in this village believes the king kills his brides with his own hands, that he is a monster who cannot control the beast inside him, and that every woman who shares his bed pays for it with her life." "Is that what you believe?" "I don't know what to believe," Elira admitted. "But I don't think that's the whole truth, or you wouldn't be looking at me the way you are right now." A faint, sad smile crossed Greta's face. "You are clever. That will help you, and it may also be dangerous for you. Listen carefully, because I will only say this once, and you must never repeat where you heard it." She glanced around, as if the empty road behind Elira might be hiding a listener, and then she leaned forward. "The king did not kill those women. I served in that citadel for 11 years, and I tell you now, Cale Draven grieved every single one of those deaths, as though he had lost a piece of his own soul. Something else took them, something that lives in the walls of that fortress, older than the current king, older than his father, and his father's father before him." Elira felt a chill move down her spine. "What kind of something?" "That I do not know," Greta said. "No one who served there long enough to learn the truth was ever allowed to speak of it outside those walls. I only know what I saw with my own eyes, and what I saw was a king who tried, again and again, to keep his brides at a distance, to protect them by refusing to love them, and who failed every single time, because grief and guilt eventually break down every wall a person builds. Then why does the throne keep forcing this selection? Why keep sending women to die?" Greta's expression turned grim. "Because the alternative, according to the old laws, is worse. I do not know the details. I only know that the pact binding the Draven bloodline demands a bride be offered, again and again, until something is either paid or broken. Be careful, child. Watch everything. Trust almost no one inside those walls, and if the king tries to keep you at a distance, do not assume it is because he does not care. It may be the opposite." Elira left Greta's cottage with more questions than answers, but for the first time since the selection bell had rung, she felt something other than pure fear. She felt purpose. If there was a real cause behind the deaths of 9 women, then perhaps there was also a way to survive it, and perhaps, if she was fast enough and careful enough, she could be the one to finally understand what that cause was. The royal carriage arrived at midday, exactly as promised, pulled by 4 enormous black horses whose eyes seemed to glow faintly amber in the daylight, marking them as more than ordinary animals. 2 guards in dark uniforms stepped down from the front, their faces unreadable, and one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw, approached the Voss family's small home, and knocked with a formality that felt almost cruel in its politeness. "Elira Voss," he said. "It is time." Marion clung to her daughter at the doorway, sobbing openly now, while Edwin stood behind her, with his jaw clenched so tight, Elira feared he might break a tooth. Nora hovered near the fireplace, too frightened to come closer, her small hands twisted in the hem of her dress. Elira hugged each of them in turn, holding on longer than was probably wise, memorizing the smell of her mother's hair, and the warmth of her father's rough hands, and the way Nora's shoulders shook against her own. "I will find a way through this," Elira whispered to her sister. "I promise you, I will come back." She did not know, as she said it, whether it was a promise she could keep, but she said it anyway, because sometimes a promise is the only thing strong enough to carry a person forward, when everything else feels impossible. The journey to the Black Citadel took most of the afternoon, winding upward through hills that grew steeper and darker with every passing mile, until the trees themselves seemed to lean away from the road, as if even the forest did not want to draw close to the fortress ahead. Elira sat alone inside the carriage, watching the scenery change through a narrow window, her small bag of belongings clutched in her lap. She tried to memorize every landmark, every turn, every gate they passed through, in case she ever needed to find her way back out again. The scarred guard, who introduced himself only as Roan, rode alongside the carriage for most of the journey, and occasionally answered her questions in short, careful sentences. He would not speak about the previous brides at all, deflecting every attempt she made to bring up the subject. But he did tell her one thing: that stuck in her mind for the rest of the ride. "The king does not choose the brides," Roan said, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "The selection chooses them. He has never once approved of the process, if that means anything to you." "Then why does he allow it to continue?" Roan's jaw tightened. "Because he has no choice either. There is more binding him than you understand, Miss Voss. You will see soon enough." The citadel itself rose out of the mountainside, like something grown rather than built, its black stone walls catching the last light of the afternoon and turning its strange shades of purple and gray. Illyra had heard descriptions of it her whole life, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of the place, or for the silence that seemed to hang over it, even from a distance, as though the fortress itself was holding its breath. As the carriage passed through the main gate, Illyra caught her first glimpse of the king. He stood at the top of the entrance stairs, tall and still, dressed in dark clothing that made him look almost like a shadow given shape. His hair was black, his expression unreadable, and even from this distance, Illyra could feel the weight of his presence, a kind of quiet power that made the guards around him stand a little straighter and speak a little softer. He did not smile as the carriage came to a stop. He did not move toward her the way she had expected a king might move toward his newest bride. Instead, he simply watched, his eyes tracking every step she took as she was helped down from the carriage. And in that watching, Illyra saw something she had not expected to see at all. She saw fear. Not fear of her, but fear for her, buried so deep beneath his controlled expression that she almost missed it entirely. "Illyra Voss," he said, when she finally stood before him at the top of the stairs, his voice low and rough, like something rarely used. "I am sorry." It was not the greeting she had expected from a king rumored to have killed 9 women. It was, if anything, the greeting of a man already grieving a death that had not yet happened, and as Illyra looked into his dark eyes, she made a silent vow to herself that whatever waited for her inside those black walls, she would not become the 10th name on a list of tragedies. She would find out the truth, and she would survive it, no matter what it took. Behind her, the great gate of the black citadel groaned shut, sealing her inside with the king, his silent guards, and whatever secret had already claimed 9 lives before hers. Inside, the citadel was even colder than it looked from the outside. Long hallways stretched in every direction, lit by torches that burned with a strange blue tint instead of ordinary orange flame. Illyra followed a quiet servant woman named Petra through the corridors, taking note of every door, every turn, every place where the stone seemed older or darker than the rest. She noticed something else too. Several doors along the western hallway were sealed with heavy iron bars, and dust had settled thick across their thresholds, as if no one had opened them in years. "What is behind those doors?" Illyra asked. Petra's steps faltered for just a moment, before she recovered and kept walking. "Old chambers, miss. Nothing that concerns you. They look sealed on purpose." "Everything in this citadel is done on purpose," Petra said quietly, and would not answer any further questions on the subject. Illyra was given a chamber on the 2nd floor, far larger and finer than anything she had ever slept in before, with a wide bed draped in dark blue fabric, and a window that looked out over the mountains. It should have felt like a luxury. Instead, it felt like a cage dressed up to look comfortable. She noticed, almost immediately, that the door had no lock on the inside, only a heavy bolt on the outside, and she wondered whether that detail was meant to keep her in, or to keep something else out. That evening she was summoned to dine with the king, not in a grand hall as she expected, but in a smaller private room, where only the 2 of them sat at a long table, far more space between them than the size of the meal required. Cale Draven barely touched his food. He watched her instead, with an intensity that made her skin prickle, though not entirely from fear. "You are frightened," he said finally, breaking the long silence between them. "Wouldn't you be, in my place?" Illyra answered, deciding that honesty was safer than pretending otherwise. Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite name. "Yes, I would be terrified. I am sorry that this is the life you have been given, Illyra Voss. I want you to know that I never asked for any of it, and I would end it if I could." "Then why can't you?" she pressed. "Why does the selection continue, if you don't want it to?" Cale's expression closed like a door shutting. "There are things bound to this house that are older than my will, older than the throne itself." I cannot explain them to you tonight. I only ask that you listen carefully to every warning given to you here, that you do not wander the western wing alone, and that you do not, under any circumstances, go near the sealed doors on the lower level after dark. Why not? Because I would very much like you to still be alive next week, he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice when he said it, only a bone-deep weariness that made Alira believe, for the first time, that Greta's words back in the village had been true. This man was not a monster hunting his brides. He was something closer to a prisoner, trapped inside his own home, by a threat he had not created and could not escape. Later that night, unable to sleep, Alira sat by her window and watched the moon rise over the Black Mountains. Somewhere deep within the citadel, she thought she heard something move, a low, dragging sound that seemed to come from beneath the floor itself, followed by a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though whatever had made the sound was now listening to see if anyone had noticed. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and made a promise to herself. She would learn everything about this place, about the 9 brides who had come before her, and about the true nature of the curse that Greta had warned her about. She would not simply wait, helpless, for her name to become the 10th entry on a list of tragedies. Whatever walked the halls of the Black Citadel, whatever had taken 9 lives before hers, she intended to understand it, outsmart it, and survive it. Outside her window, far below in the courtyard, a shadow moved between the old stone statues, too large and too silent to belong to any ordinary guard, and then it was gone, leaving Alira staring into the darkness with her heart hammering and a single certainty settling cold and heavy in her chest. Her first night in the Black Citadel was only just beginning, and already, she understood that nothing about this place was going to be simple, or safe, or anything close to what she had imagined. A soft knock came at her door not long after, so quiet she almost mistook it for the wind. When she opened it, she found an older man standing in the corridor, dressed in the fine robes of a court advisor, his silver hair combed neatly back, and his smile a touch too practiced to be entirely comforting. He introduced himself as Alden Marsh, chief advisor to the throne, and said he had come to welcome her personally, since the king himself rarely extended such courtesies. "You must be very tired," Alden said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I only wish to say that if you ever need anything at all, anything the king cannot provide, you may always come to me. I have served this house for many years. I know its secrets better than anyone left alive." There was something about the way he said secrets that made Alira's instincts prickle with unease, though she could not have explained exactly why. She thanked him politely and said nothing more, and after he left, she stood by the door for a long moment, thinking of Greta's warning to trust almost no one inside these walls. She thought of Roan's guarded honesty on the road, of Cale's strange sorrow at dinner, of Petra's nervous refusal to speak about the sealed doors, and of Alden Marsh's too smooth smile, and she understood that surviving the Black Citadel would require more than luck. It would require watching everyone, trusting carefully, and moving faster than whatever hunted in the dark ever expected a frightened new bride to move. Before she finally allowed herself to sleep, Alira took a candle from her bedside table and knelt beside the door, examining the old wood for any sign of what might have happened to the women who slept in this very room before her. She found nothing obvious, no stains, no marks, nothing that spoke openly of tragedy, and yet the room felt heavy with something unspoken, as though the walls themselves remembered every scream that had ever echoed within them, and had simply learned, over time, to keep silent. She blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind move against the old stone. And somewhere far below, so faint she almost convinced herself she had imagined it, she heard that same slow, dragging sound again, moving steadily closer to the heart of the citadel, before finally fading into nothing. Sleep did not come easily that first night, but when it finally did, Alira dreamed of 9 women standing in a circle of candlelight, their faces turned toward her, their mouths moving in silent warning she could not quite understand. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and a single thought burning clear in her mind. Whatever secret the Black Citadel was hiding, she intended to uncover it before it could claim her the way it had claimed every bride who came before. Morning light had barely touched the mountains when a sharp cry echoed through the citadel halls, jolting Alira awake with her heart slamming against her ribs. She sat up, listening hard. But the sound did not repeat itself. Only silence followed, thick and unnatural, the kind of silence that felt like it was hiding something, rather than simply being empty. She dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor, where she found Petra standing frozen near the top of the staircase, her face pale as chalk, her hands pressed tightly together. "What happened?" Elira asked. "I heard someone scream." Petra shook her head quickly, too quickly. "Nothing happened, miss. One of the kitchen girls dropped a pot, that is all. Please, go back to your room and rest." Elira did not believe her for a single moment, but she also understood that pushing too hard, too fast, would only make the servants close ranks against her. So she nodded and let Petra lead her back toward her chamber, though she made careful note of the direction the sound had come from, the eastern wing, near the old chapel that Petra herself had refused to walk past the day before. Breakfast was served in the same small private room as dinner the night before, and once again, Cale Draven sat across from her with barely touched food, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of something he could not put into words. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person after years of carrying a burden alone. "You heard something this morning," he said, not quite a question. "I did. Petra told me a kitchen girl dropped a pot." "That is what she was instructed to tell you," Cale said, surprising her with his honesty. "The truth is that one of the guards patrolling the eastern wing was injured overnight. He will recover, but I will not insult you by pretending nothing happened. You deserve better than that, even if I cannot yet tell you everything." The day they invaded Earth, for the first time, the galaxy learned true fear. "Then tell me what you can." Cale set down his cup and looked at her directly, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt as though he was truly seeing her, not as a duty forced upon him by an ancient law, but as a person standing in front of him, frightened, and trying to be brave anyway. "There is a presence in this citadel," he said slowly. "It has been here longer than my father, longer than his father before him. It does not show itself often, and when it does, it is rarely seen directly, only felt, only heard, only known through the damage it leaves behind. I do not fully understand its nature, and I have spent most of my life trying to learn how to control it, without success. Is this what killed the 9 brides before me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elira thought he might refuse to answer at all. Then he nodded, once, a small, painful motion. "Yes," he said, though not in the way the village whispers imagine. It did not attack them in some dramatic battle. It found them slowly, over weeks, testing them, weakening them, until eventually it took what it wanted. I have never been able to stop it in time. I have only ever been able to watch it happen, again and again, and bury what remained. Elira felt a chill settle over her skin, but strangely, hearing the truth spoken plainly, felt better than living inside the vague dread of not knowing. At least now she understood the shape of the danger she was facing, even if she did not yet understand its full nature. "Then help me understand it," she said. "If I know what it is, maybe I can help you stop it, before it reaches me." Something shifted in Cale's expression, a flicker of surprise, almost hope, quickly buried beneath his usual careful control. "No one has ever asked me that before," he admitted quietly. "Every bride before you either accepted her fate with quiet despair or begged me to send her home, which I could never do, because refusing the selection carries its own dangers, both for the bride and for her family. I'm not going to just accept it," Elira said firmly, "and I'm not asking you to send me home. I'm asking you to let me help." For a long moment, Cale simply looked at her, and something in his dark eyes softened in a way that made Elira's chest tighten with an emotion she was not prepared to examine too closely. "Very well," he said finally. "I will show you what I know. But you must promise me you will be careful, and that you will trust nothing in this citadel completely, not even me." "Why not you?" "Because even I do not fully understand what I might become, under the wrong circumstances," he said, and the honesty in his voice was somehow more frightening than any threat could have been. That afternoon, Cale led her personally through parts of the citadel she had not yet seen, moving with the quiet authority of a man who knew every stone of his own home intimately. He showed her the old chapel in the eastern wing, its windows shattered long ago and never repaired, its altar cracked down the middle, as though struck by something enormously powerful. He showed her the family portraits lining the long gallery, generations of Draven rulers whose eyes, painted centuries ago, seemed to follow her as she walked past. My great-grandfather, Cale said, stopping in front of one particular portrait, a stern-faced man with cold eyes and a crown that seemed too heavy for his narrow head. He made a choice that bound this family to something we have never been able to undo. What choice? I do not know the full story, Cale admitted. Much of it has been deliberately buried, records destroyed, witnesses silenced over the generations. What I do know is that he broke a promise made to a group of women with old and powerful abilities in exchange for securing his throne. And promises broken to such women rarely go unanswered. Alira studied the portrait, memorizing the man's face, the shape of the crown, the small symbol embroidered into the collar of his robes, a symbol she did not recognize but intended to research further at the first opportunity. There must be records somewhere, something that survived the destruction. There is an archive, Cale said slowly, as though the idea had only just occurred to him. Deep beneath the citadel, sealed off since my father's time. I have never had reason to search it thoroughly. Perhaps it is time that changed. They were interrupted before they could discuss the archive further by the arrival of a broad-shouldered man Alira recognized from the family portrait's more modern editions, though clearly younger and very much alive. He introduced himself as Bastian Crane, a senior member of the King's Council, and his expression carried a wariness that he did not bother to hide as his eyes moved between Cale and Alira. Your Majesty, Bastian said, his tone carrying just enough formality to feel pointed. The Council requests your presence. There are matters concerning the border pacts that cannot wait. Cale's expression shuddered closed again, the openness Alira had glimpsed moments earlier folding away behind practiced royal composure. I will be there shortly, he said, and Bastian nodded, though his gaze lingered on Alira a moment longer than necessary before he turned and left. He does not trust me, Alira observed once they were alone again. Bastian Crane does not trust anyone easily, Cale said. He has served this house since before I was born, and he has watched every one of the 9 brides arrive with hope and leave in tragedy. I imagine, in his own way, he is trying to protect what remains of this family from more grief. Or he knows something he isn't telling either of us, Alira said. Cale glanced at her, something like respect flickering across his features. You think quickly. That instinct will serve you well here. But be careful how openly you voice such suspicions. This citadel has ears in more places than you might expect. He was called away shortly after, leaving Alira alone in the long gallery, with generations of painted Draven eyes watching her from the walls. She did not return immediately to her chamber. Instead, she made her way carefully toward the lower levels of the citadel, following the direction Cale had gestured toward when he mentioned the sealed archive, memorizing the turns of the stone staircase as she descended into cooler, darker air. She did not find the archive that day. The stairway ended at a heavy iron door, locked tight, with no visible keyhole or mechanism she could identify. But as she stood there, running her fingers along the cold metal, she felt something she could not quite explain. A faint vibration beneath her palm, almost like a heartbeat, slow and steady, coming from somewhere deep on the other side of the door. She pulled her hand back quickly, her pulse racing, and for a long moment she simply stood there in the dim torchlight, staring at the sealed door, and wondering exactly what kind of heartbeat could belong to something that had already outlived 9 brides and showed no sign of stopping. Behind her, footsteps echoed on the stone stairs, unhurried and deliberate, and Alira turned to find Alden Marsh watching her from a few steps above, his expression carefully pleasant, though his eyes carried a sharpness that had not been there during their first meeting. This is not a place for wandering, Miss Voss, he said smoothly. Some doors in this citadel are sealed for very good reasons. I would hate for anything unfortunate to happen to you so soon after your arrival. Alira held his gaze, refusing to let him see how much his sudden appearance had unsettled her. I was simply exploring my new home. Of course, Alden said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Allow me to escort you back upstairs. It would be a shame if you were to become lost down here, in the dark, all alone. As she followed him back up the stone staircase, Alira could not shake the feeling that his words had carried a warning far more specific than simple concern for her safety, and she resolved, more firmly than ever, that she would find her way back to that sealed door, with or without anyone's permission, and that she would not stop until she understood exactly what was waiting on the other side. That evening, Illyra sought out Roan, the scarred guard who had escorted her carriage on the journey to the citadel. She found him standing watch near the main courtyard, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the darkening grounds with the practiced attention of a man who took his duties seriously. He glanced at her approach but did not relax his stance. "You should not be out here after dark, Miss Voss," he said. "I wanted to ask you something," Illyra said, keeping her voice low. "You told me on the road that the king never chooses the brides, that something else is bound to the selection. Do you know what happened to the archive beneath the citadel, the one sealed behind the iron door on the lower level?" Roan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You have already gone looking for it." "I have." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the courtyard, as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "My grandfather served this house as well, in the time of the old king. He used to tell me stories, before he passed, about a night when the archive was still open, before it was sealed by royal order. He said the records down there spoke of a coven of women in the northern hills, gifted with abilities most in Blackmore Ridge no longer believe are real. He said the current king's great-grandfather made an agreement with them, and then broke it, and that the breaking of that agreement is the true root of everything that has happened since. Do you know the nature of the agreement?" Roan shook his head. "Only fragments. My grandfather was young when he heard the stories himself, and much of what he remembered had already been distorted by years of retelling. But he did tell me one thing clearly, and I have never forgotten it. He said the coven did not simply curse the bloodline out of anger. He said they bound something to this house, something meant to test every bride who entered these walls, to see whether the Draven line was capable of the very thing his great-grandfather had failed to offer them in the first place." "Which was what?" "Loyalty," Roan said quietly. "Genuine, unbroken loyalty, freely given rather than bought or forced. My grandfather believed the curse would only end when a king and his bride proved that such loyalty could still exist between them, despite everything working against it." Illyra absorbed this in silence, turning the idea over in her mind. If Roan's grandfather's stories held any truth, it meant the deaths of the 9 brides before her were not random cruelty, but the tragic result of fear and distance keeping every previous pairing from ever growing close enough to satisfy whatever test the ancient coven had designed. Cale's own instinct to keep his brides at arm's length, meant to protect them, may have been exactly what doomed them instead. "Thank you," Illyra said. "I know this was not easy to share." Roan's expression remained guarded, but something in his stance eased slightly. "Be careful who else you share this with, Miss Voss. Not everyone within these walls wishes to see the curse broken. Some have built their entire position around its continuation." His words echoed uncomfortably in her mind as she made her way back toward her chamber, passing beneath the flickering blue torchlight that lined every corridor of the Black Citadel. She thought of Alden Marsh's too smooth smile, of Bastion Crane's guarded suspicion, and wondered which of them, if any, might have reason to want the curse to continue rather than end. Later, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Illyra sat at the small writing desk in her chamber and began recording everything she had learned since her arrival, determined to keep track of every detail, no matter how small it seemed. The sealed archive, the symbol on the ancestor's portrait, the heartbeat she had felt through the iron door. Roan's story about the coven and the test of loyalty, Alden's sudden appearance at exactly the wrong moment, Bastion's obvious distrust. Each detail felt like a single thread in a much larger pattern she had not yet fully seen, but she was determined to keep pulling at those threads until the entire shape of the truth revealed itself. A soft knock interrupted her writing, and when she opened the door, she found Cale standing in the corridor, his expression unusually open in the dim light, as though the events of the day had worn away some of his careful royal composure. "I wanted to make sure you were well," he said. "After what happened this morning, and after Alden mentioned finding you near the lower levels. He told you about that." "He tells me many things," Cale said, a trace of dry humor entering his voice for the first time since her arrival. "Whether all of them are meant to help me, or simply to remind me how closely I am watched, I have never been entirely certain." Illyra studied him carefully, weighing whether to share what Roan had told her. She decided, in that moment, that trust had to begin somewhere, and that if she wanted Kale's genuine partnership in uncovering the truth, she could not keep everything locked away out of caution alone. "I spoke with Roan tonight," she said. "He told me a story his grandfather used to tell, about a coven in the northern hills, and an agreement your great-grandfather broke. He said the curse might be tied to loyalty, to whether a king and his bride can build something real, despite everything working against it." Kale went very still, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That is the first time I have heard that particular detail," he admitted quietly. "Loyalty, freely given. It would explain a great deal, if it is true. It would explain why keeping every bride before you at a careful distance never once succeeded in protecting them." "Then perhaps distance is not the answer," Illyra said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Something shifted in Kale's expression, a mixture of hope and fear, so raw it made her chest tighten in response. "Perhaps not," he said softly. "But closeness carries its own risks, Illyra. If I allow myself to care for you the way this curse may require, and I still fail to protect you, I do not know if I could survive losing you the way I have lost the 9 before you." "Then we will simply have to make sure that failure is not the outcome," Illyra said, holding his gaze steadily, refusing to let her own fear show through her voice. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something new and fragile and dangerous, in ways that had nothing to do with ancient curses or sealed archives. Then Kale nodded, once, and stepped back from her doorway. "Rest well tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we will find a way into that archive, together, and we will begin uncovering exactly what my family owes, and to whom, and what it will truly take to finally set this house free." Long after he had gone, Illyra lay awake in the darkness, listening to the wind move against the ancient stone walls, and thinking not of fear, but of the strange, unexpected warmth that had settled in her chest at the sound of Kale's voice, promising to face the truth together with her, rather than leaving her to face it alone. The iron door groaned open at last, and cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a scent like old parchment and something else Illyra could not quite name, something faintly metallic and strange. Kale stood beside her, a lit torch in one hand, his expression tense as he stepped across the threshold he had avoided for most of his life. "I have not been down here since I was a boy," he admitted, his voice echoing softly against the stone walls. "My father brought me once, when I was young, and told me never to return without his permission. He never explained why." The archive stretched out before them, rows of tall shelves packed with scrolls, bound books, and stacks of loose parchment, all coated in decades of undisturbed dust. Illyra moved carefully between the shelves, her fingers brushing lightly across the spines of ancient volumes, searching for anything that might carry the symbol she had seen embroidered on the ancestor's collar in the portrait upstairs. It took nearly an hour of careful searching before she found it, a thick, leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of tax records, its cover embossed with the same strange symbol, a circle broken by 3 jagged lines. She pulled it free carefully, the old leather cracking slightly under her touch, and brought it to the small reading table at the center of the archive where Kale had set his torch. The journal belonged, according to its opening pages, to a woman named Celine, who identified herself as the leader of a coven that had once lived in the northern hills of Blackmore Ridge, decades before the current Draven line had risen to power over the territory. Illyra read aloud as she turned the fragile pages, translating the old, formal language as best she could, while Kale listened in tense silence beside her. The journal described a terrible winter, decades ago, when the territory had faced a brutal conflict between rival packs, and Celine's coven had agreed to use their old and rare abilities to help secure the throne for Kale's great-grandfather, in exchange for a promise of protection and respect for their people going forward. The coven's assistance had worked, the territory was united under Draven rule, and for a short time, the promise had seemingly been honored. But as the years passed, and the new king grew more secure in his power, the promise had quietly been abandoned. The coven's protections were stripped away one by one. Their lands were seized under new laws, and when Celine herself came to the citadel to demand the king honor his original agreement, she was turned away at the gate and told, according to her own account, that the crown no longer required the services of women whose only value had been in a moment of desperate need. Illyra's voice grew quieter as she read Celine's final entry in the journal. written in a hand that trembled with barely restrained fury. He has broken his word, and in doing so, he has broken the bond of trust between our peoples forever. I will not simply accept this betrayal in silence. I bind this house, and every king who comes after him, to a test that cannot be bought, cannot be threatened, and cannot be avoided through power alone. Every bride offered to secure the Draven throne shall face what I faced. She shall be brought into a house built on broken promises, surrounded by those who do not truly see her, and she shall be tested to see whether genuine loyalty, the very thing this king denied us, can still exist within these walls. If it cannot, she will not survive. And this house shall continue paying that price, generation after generation, until a king and his bride prove that the loyalty my people were denied can still be found somewhere in this bloodline. Kale sat back slowly, his face pale in the flickering torchlight. 9 women, he said quietly. 9 women died because my great-grandfather broke a promise, decades before any of them were even born. It's not your fault, Elira said, though she understood the words would do little to ease the weight visibly settling over him. It became my responsibility, the moment I inherited this throne, Kale said, and I have spent my entire reign keeping every bride at a careful distance, believing that distance would protect them, when in truth, I was simply guaranteeing that Celine's test would never be passed. I was ensuring their deaths through the very method I believed would save them. Elira reached out and placed her hand gently over his, an instinct rather than a decision, and felt him go still beneath her touch. Then we know now what has to change, she said. We stop keeping distance out of fear. We build something real, deliberately, and we prove that this bloodline is capable of exactly what your great-grandfather refused to offer. And if we fail? Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. If genuine loyalty is not enough, or if the timing is wrong, or if the curse decides to test us before we are ready, then we will have tried honestly, Elira said, which is more than any of the 9 brides before me were ever given the chance to do. They spent the following hours searching the archive further, and found additional records confirming details of the original agreement, maps of the Coven's former lands, and a final entry, added by a different hand decades later, noting that all attempts to locate any surviving members of Celine's coven had failed. The northern hills, once home to her people, had long since been resettled by ordinary villagers who knew nothing of what had once lived there. If the coven no longer exists, Elira said thoughtfully, then who, or what, has been enforcing Celine's binding all these years? Kale's expression turned grim. That is the question I have never been able to answer. Whatever moves through this citadel, whatever took the 9 brides before you, it does not need Celine's presence to continue operating. The binding itself seems to have taken on a life of its own, sustained by something beyond her original intention. As if summoned by the very discussion of it, a low, dragging sound echoed suddenly from somewhere deeper within the archive, beyond the reach of their torchlight, and both of them went instantly silent, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint drop in temperature that raised goosebumps along Elira's arms, despite the layers of clothing she wore. We need to leave, Kale said quietly, rising to his feet and gathering the journal carefully. Now. They moved quickly back toward the iron door, the dragging sound following at a steady, unhurried pace that felt somehow more menacing than if it had rushed toward them. Elira did not look back, focusing instead on the flickering light of the torch ahead of her and the solid presence of Kale's hand, gripping hers tightly, as they climbed the stone staircase back toward the main level of the citadel. Only once the heavy iron door had been sealed behind them did the sound finally fade, leaving nothing but silence and the rapid pounding of both their hearts in the narrow stone corridor. It knows we were down there, Kale said grimly. It knows what we found. Then we need to move faster than it expects, Elira said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her effort to sound composed. If Celine's binding requires genuine loyalty to break it, then perhaps the presence itself grows stronger, the longer that loyalty remains unbuilt. We may not have as much time as we hoped. Kale nodded slowly, his expression hardening with new resolve. Then we begin properly tomorrow. No more distance. No more careful avoidance out of fear. If loyalty is what this curse demands, I intend to give it every honest chance to succeed, for your sake, and for the sake of every bride who came before you. and never had the chance. They parted ways near her chamber door, and though the day had left Alira exhausted and shaken by everything they had uncovered, she found herself unable to fully release the warmth that had settled in her chest at Cale's words, at the memory of his hand gripping hers as they fled the archive together, at the growing certainty that whatever waited ahead of them, she would not be facing it entirely alone. The following morning brought unexpected trouble in the form of Bastian Crane, who requested a private audience with Alira before she had even finished her breakfast. He met her in a small sitting room off the main hall, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes carried the same wariness she had noticed during their first meeting. "I understand you and His Majesty visited the lower archive yesterday," Bastian said without preamble. "We did," Alira confirmed, deciding there was little value in denying it. "That archive has been sealed by royal order for good reason, Miss Voss. Whatever you believe you discovered down there, I would advise extreme caution before acting on it." "You know about Celine's binding," Alira said, watching his reaction carefully. Something flickered across Bastian's face, quickly controlled. "I know a great deal about the history of this house, Miss Voss. I have served it faithfully for many years, and I have watched 9 brides arrive with hope, much like yours, only to meet the same tragic end. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because I would rather you understand the reality of your situation than continue chasing false hope through old journals and forbidden archives. You think we shouldn't try to break the curse? I think," Bastian said carefully, "that certain traditions exist for reasons beyond what any single person, even a king, can fully understand or safely disrupt. I have seen the consequences of reckless action in this house before. I would rather not see them again." His words carried an edge of genuine concern, but also something else, something Alira could not quite place, a note of caution that felt less like protective wisdom and more like a warning, meant to discourage her from digging any further into the truth. She thanked him politely for his advice and left the sitting room with her suspicions about him deepening rather than easing. Later that day, she found Cale in the training yard, working through a series of exercises with a wooden practice blade, his movements sharp and controlled despite the visible tension in his shoulders. He paused when he saw her approaching, setting the blade aside and wiping sweat from his brow. "Bastian spoke with you," he said, not quite a question. "He knows about Celine's binding," Alira confirmed, "and he seemed very interested in discouraging me from pursuing it further." Cale's expression darkened. "Bastian has served this house since before I was born. He was present for the deaths of several of the previous brides, and I have always assumed his caution came from genuine grief over what he witnessed. But if he already knew the truth of Celine's binding and chose never to share it with me, that raises questions I do not like the answers to. Do you think he could be working against breaking the curse deliberately?" "I do not know," Cale admitted. "But I intend to find out. In the meantime, we continue as planned. Come, walk with me. There is a place in the Eastern Gardens I used to visit as a boy, before the weight of the throne made such simple pleasures feel impossible to justify. I would like to show it to you, if you are willing." Alira agreed, and as they walked together through the quiet stone corridors toward the gardens, she felt something shifting between them, subtle but undeniable, the careful distance of their first meeting giving way, slowly and deliberately, to something warmer, something that felt, despite every danger surrounding them, remarkably like the beginning of genuine trust. The Eastern Gardens, when they reached them, were more beautiful than Alira had expected, tucked away behind a high stone wall and filled with flowering trees that seemed to defy the otherwise cold, imposing character of the rest of the citadel. Cale showed her a small stone bench beneath the largest tree, explaining that his mother had planted it herself, before her death when he was still young, and that he had rarely returned since, finding the memory too painful to revisit alone. "Thank you for sharing this with me," Alira said softly, settling onto the bench beside him. "Thank you for asking the right questions," Cale replied, "and for refusing to simply accept the fate that was handed to you without a fight. No one has ever done that before, not the way you have." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the afternoon light filter through the flowering branches above them, and for the first time since the selection bell had rung in her village, Alira allowed herself to feel something other than fear about the path ahead of her. It was not certainty, and it was not safety, but it was hope, fragile and new, and in a place built on broken promises and ancient grief, that felt like more than enough to hold on to for now. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and cast long shadows across the citadel courtyard, Elira found herself unable to shake the feeling that Bastian's warning had carried more weight than a simple concern for tradition. She sought out Roan again, finding him near the stables this time, checking the shoes of one of the great black horses with careful, practiced hands. "I need to ask you something else," Elira said, keeping her voice low despite the emptiness of the stable yard around them. Roan glanced up, his expression already guarded, as though he sensed the question would not be an easy one. "Ask then." "Bastian Crane, what do you know about his history with the previous brides?" Roan set down the horse's hoof slowly, straightening to his full height. "He has served on the king's council since before the old king's death. He was present, I believe, for at least 6 of the 9 losses. Some say the 5th bride's death affected him most deeply. He grew quieter after that, more insistent on tradition, more resistant to any suggestion of challenging the old ways. Do you think grief could explain his behavior toward me? His warning to leave the curse alone?" "It could," Roan said carefully. "Grief changes people in strange ways, Miss Voss. Some grow bolder in the face of loss, determined to prevent it from happening again through change. Others grow more fearful, more convinced that any deviation from the familiar path only invites greater tragedy. I have always believed Bastian falls into the second category." "But you're not certain?" Roan's jaw tightened slightly. "No, I am not certain of very much in this citadel anymore, Miss Voss. I have served here long enough to know that grief and self-interest can sometimes wear very similar faces, and it is not always easy to tell which one you are truly looking at, until it is far too late to matter." His words stayed with Elira long after she left the stables, turning over in her mind as she made her way back through the darkening corridors toward her chamber. She thought of Bastian's carefully neutral expression, of the way his eyes had lingered on her and Cale together in the long gallery days earlier, of the pointed timing of his interruption just as Cale had begun to open up about the archive. Perhaps it was simple grief, exactly as Roan suggested. But perhaps it was something else entirely, something that benefited, in ways she did not yet understand, from the curse continuing rather than ending. She resolved to watch him more carefully in the days ahead, cataloging his movements and reactions, the same way she had begun cataloging every other detail of her new, dangerous life within the Black Citadel's walls. Dinner that night was a quieter affair than the previous evenings, both Elira and Cale lost in their own thoughts following the discoveries in the archive and the unsettling conversation with Bastian. But the silence between them felt different now, less strained, more comfortable, the kind of quiet that exists between two people who no longer feel the need to fill every moment with careful, guarded words. "I have been thinking about what you said," Cale said eventually, setting down his cup and meeting her eyes across the table. "About building something real, deliberately, rather than allowing distance and fear to continue dictating everything between us. And I find that I want that," he admitted, his voice carrying a rawness that surprised her. "Not simply because Celine's binding may require it, but because I find that I want to know you, Elira Voss, beyond the circumstances that brought you here. I have spent so many years keeping every part of myself locked away, convinced that caring for anyone would only lead to more grief, more loss, more names, added to a list I already carry with me every single day. I am tired of living that way." Elira felt something warm and fragile bloom in her chest at his words, an emotion she had not expected to feel so soon, given everything hanging over both their heads. "Then let's try," she said simply. "Together. No more distance out of fear." Cale reached across the table and took her hand gently in his, and though the gesture was simple, it felt, in that moment, like the beginning of something far larger than either of them could yet fully understand. A small act of defiance against generations of grief and broken promises. A single deliberate step toward finally breaking a cycle that had claimed 9 lives before hers. Later, as Elira prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not of the dragging sound in the archive, or Bastian's veiled warnings, or even the sealed doors still hiding secrets she had not yet uncovered, but of the warmth in Cale's dark eyes, as he had spoken of wanting to know her beyond the fate that had brought them together. For the first time since the selection bell had rung in her village, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond simple survival, A future where she and Cale might genuinely build the kind of loyalty Celine's coven had once been denied, and in doing so, finally set an entire bloodline free from the weight of its ancestors' broken promise. But even as hope settled gently into her chest, she did not forget the low, dragging sound that had followed them through the archive, patient and unhurried, as though it already understood something about the timeline of their efforts that they themselves had not yet grasped. Whatever tested every bride who entered these walls was still out there, somewhere within the ancient stones of the Black Citadel, watching, waiting, and Alira understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that hope alone would not be enough to guarantee her survival. Hope had to be paired with vigilance, with careful investigation, and with a willingness to move faster than 9 failed attempts before her ever had. She fell asleep that night, with the journal's final words echoing in her mind, Celine's furious, grieving voice, promising a test that could not be bought, or threatened, or avoided through power alone. Only earned through genuine, unbroken loyalty, and as sleep finally claimed her, Alira dreamed once again of 9 women, standing in a circle of candlelight, but this time, instead of silent warning, their faces carried something that looked almost like hope, as though they too were watching to see whether the 10th bride might finally succeed where all of them had failed. Alira woke with a jolt, her chest tight, her breath coming fast, though nothing in her chamber appeared to have changed since she had fallen asleep. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she heard it again, the same faint scratching sound that had pulled her from sleep in the first place, coming from somewhere near the window. She rose carefully and crossed the cold stone floor, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to look outside. The courtyard below sat empty and still, under the pale light of a half-moon, nothing moving among the old statues or along the garden paths. And yet the scratching continued, closer now, unmistakably coming from somewhere along the outer wall of her own chamber. Her heart pounding, Alira backed away from the window and moved quickly toward the door, intending to seek out Cale or Roan or anyone who might help her understand what was happening. But before she reached the door, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against her ears. Then the temperature in the room dropped, sharply, all at once, her breath suddenly visible in the moonlight, and a shadow detached itself from the darkest corner of her chamber, tall and formless, with no clear edges, no clear shape at all, only a suggestion of something vast and ancient, pressing against the boundaries of the physical world. Alira froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move, locked in place by a fear more absolute than anything she had ever experienced. The shadow drifted closer, and she felt, rather than heard, a voice pressing directly into her thoughts, cold and hollow and utterly without mercy. "You are the 10th, you will not be the last." The words echoed through her mind, and pain suddenly bloomed across her chest, sharp and burning, as though invisible claws had raked across her skin. She cried out, stumbling backward, and her voice, finally freed from whatever had held it silent, carried loud enough through the stone corridors to bring running footsteps within moments. The chamber door burst open, and Cale rushed inside, his eyes immediately finding the shadow still hovering near the center of the room. His expression transformed instantly, fear giving way to fury, and he moved between Alira and the presence with a speed that seemed almost inhuman, his own eyes flashing with a dangerous amber light she had not seen from him before. "Leave her," Cale commanded, his voice carrying an authority that shook the very stones around them. "This one is not yours yet." The shadow seemed to consider this for a long, terrible moment, and then, without warning, it simply dissolved, retreating back into the darkness of the corner it had emerged from, leaving nothing behind but the lingering cold and the faint, throbbing pain still radiating across Alira's chest. Cale turned to her immediately, his hands gentle despite the barely controlled fury still visible in his expression, and helped her to sit on the edge of her bed. "Are you hurt? Let me see." Alira pulled aside the collar of her nightclothes with trembling hands, revealing 3 thin red marks across her collarbone, already beginning to fade, but still visible enough to confirm that whatever had happened had been very real. Cale's jaw clenched at the sight, and for a moment, the guilt and fear in his expression looked almost unbearable to witness. "I should not have left you alone tonight," he said, his voice rough. "I knew it was growing bolder after the archive. I should have insisted on staying closer. This isn't your fault, Elira said, though her voice still trembled from shock. What was that? What did it say to me? Cale's expression darkened further. What did it say? It said, I am the 10th, and that I will not be the last. A muscle jumped in Cale's jaw. It is trying to frighten you into giving up before you have even had the chance to try. That is exactly why we cannot allow fear to stop us now, Elira. If anything, tonight only confirms that we are on the right path, that our decision to build something real between us has already been noticed. Roan arrived moments later, breathless from running, his sword already drawn, and behind him, several other guards fanned out through the corridor, searching the surrounding chambers for any further sign of the presence. Petra appeared as well, her face white with fear, immediately fetching cool water and clean cloth to tend to the marks on Elira's collarbone, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. This has happened before, Elira said quietly, watching Petra's trembling hands. Hasn't it? To the others. Petra's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Elira thought she might refuse to answer entirely. Then the older woman nodded, once, her voice barely above a whisper. The fourth bride, Lady Miriam. She came to me the night before she died, with marks just like these. I did not understand what they meant then. I did not want to understand. What happened after? 3 days later she simply did not wake, Petra said, tears finally spilling over. I found her myself. There was no struggle in the room, no sign of violence, only her body, cold and still, as though whatever had taken her had done so gently, almost peacefully, which somehow made it worse. The room fell silent following Petra's account, the weight of 9 previous tragedies pressing down on all of them at once. Elira felt Cale's hand find hers, gripping tightly, and when she looked up at him, she saw not the composed, distant king who had greeted her on her first day, but a man terrified of losing something he had only just begun to allow himself to want. I will not let that happen to you, Cale said, his voice fierce with a determination that startled her with its intensity. Whatever it takes, Elira, I will not let history repeat itself with you. Then we need to move faster, Elira said, steadying her own voice, despite the fear still coursing through her. If the presence is already testing me only days after our discovery in the archive, we cannot afford to wait patiently and hope loyalty builds naturally over time. We need to actively pursue whatever will satisfy Celine's original demand, and we need to do it quickly. Cale nodded slowly, his expression hardening with resolve. Tomorrow, I will speak with Bastian directly, and press him harder on what he truly knows about the previous bride's final days. If he witnessed 6 of the 9 losses, he may hold details that could help us understand exactly what triggers the presence's attacks, and how we might avoid triggering them again before we are ready. And I will return to the archive, Elira said. There may be more records we missed, details about how previous generations attempted to satisfy the binding, even if they ultimately failed. Not alone, Cale said firmly. Not after tonight. Not alone, Elira agreed, and found, despite the lingering fear still coursing through her, a strange comfort in the simple certainty of his presence beside her. The guards remained stationed outside her chamber for the rest of the night, and Cale himself refused to leave, sitting in a chair near her bed, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window. Elira drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, waking every so often to find him still there, watchful and unmoving, and each time, the sight of him steadied her racing heart just enough to allow her to close her eyes again. By morning, word of the attack had spread quietly through the Citadel staff, and Elira noticed the change immediately in the careful, sympathetic glances several of the servants gave her as she made her way to breakfast. Bastian arrived shortly after, his expression grave, and this time, when he addressed her, his tone carried none of the veiled warning from their previous conversation, only genuine, weary concern. I heard what happened, he said. I am sorry, Miss Voss, truly. Then help us, Elira said directly, deciding that gentleness had accomplished little in their previous exchange. You witnessed 6 of the 9 attacks before mine. You must have noticed patterns, details that could help us understand how to prevent this from happening again. Bastian hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Cale, who nodded firmly, granting silent permission for whatever Bastian might be about to share. Finally, the older man sighed, the weariness in his expression deepening into something closer to genuine grief. Every attack I witnessed occurred within days of a significant moment of connection between the king and his bride, Bastian said slowly. A shared confidence, an act of trust, a moment where the wall between them began to lower. I always assumed this meant closeness itself invited the danger, which is why I have spent years counseling distance rather than intimacy. But perhaps, he continued, his voice growing thoughtful, perhaps I had the pattern backward all along. Perhaps the presence does not attack because of closeness itself, but because it senses closeness beginning and moves quickly to test whether it is genuine, or whether it will collapse under pressure, exactly as it always has before. Illyra exchanged a look with Kale, both of them recognizing the significance of Bastian's realization immediately. If the presence attacked specifically to test the strength of a growing bond, then surviving its assaults, together, without allowing fear to drive them apart again, might be exactly what was required to eventually satisfy Celine's ancient demand. Then we cannot afford to retreat from each other now, Kale said firmly. No matter how frightening these attacks become, pulling away will only guarantee failure, just as it has for every king before me. I agree, Bastian said quietly, surprising all of them. I am sorry, Miss Voss, for the caution I counseled before. I believed I was protecting you. I see now I may have been guiding you toward the very outcome I wished to prevent. The conversation left Illyra with a mixture of fear and cautious hope, understanding now, more clearly than ever, exactly what stood between her and survival within these ancient, grief-heavy walls. The path forward would require courage, not distance, and a willingness to face whatever the present sent against them, without allowing terror to drive a wedge between the fragile trust she and Kale had only just begun building. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains once again, Illyra found Kale waiting for her in the eastern gardens, beneath his mother's flowering tree, and though the marks on her collarbone still ached faintly beneath her collar, she felt, walking toward him, a determination, stronger than any fear the shadow presence had managed to instill in her the night before. We continue, she said simply, settling beside him on the stone bench. We continue, Kale agreed, taking her hand in his once more, and together, beneath the quiet rustle of flowering branches, they began, deliberately and without fear, to build the very thing an ancient, grieving coven had once been cruelly denied. Days passed, and the citadel settled into a strange new rhythm, one where fear and hope existed side by side in nearly every hour. Illyra spent her mornings with Kale, walking the grounds, sharing stories of their childhoods, learning the small details that made up a life, the kind of details that had never been offered space to grow between him and any bride before her. She learned that he had once wanted to become a healer rather than a king, before duty made that dream impossible. She told him about her sister Nora, about the small kindnesses her mother wove into every hem she sewed, about the quiet strength her father carried, without ever raising his voice. In turn, Kale grew steadily more open with her, sharing memories of his own mother, of the years before the crown had settled so heavily on his shoulders, of the guilt he carried for every bride he had failed to save. Illyra listened without judgment, offering comfort where she could, and slowly, carefully, she watched the guarded distance in his eyes soften into something warmer, something that looked, more and more with each passing day, remarkably like trust. The presence did not return immediately, though its absence brought no real comfort, only a tense, waiting silence that seemed to stretch tighter with every peaceful day that passed. Illyra used the time wisely, returning to the archive with Kale at her side, searching for any additional records that might reveal how previous kings had attempted, and failed, to satisfy Celine's demand. They found fragments of an account describing the fifth king's reign, written by an anonymous hand, describing a bride named Corinne who had come closer than any before her to surviving her full first year in the citadel. The account described a king and bride who had built genuine affection between them, only for the king's own fear of loss to eventually drive him to distance himself deliberately, believing, wrongly, that protecting his own heart would somehow also protect hers. Corinne had died 3 months later, and the account noted, with quiet tragedy, that the king himself had never fully recovered from the guilt of his own retreat. That will not be us, Kale said firmly, after Illyra finished reading the account aloud. Whatever fear rises in me, Illyra, I promise you, I will not retreat from you the way that King retreated from Corinne. I would rather face every possible loss honestly, beside you, than repeat his mistake and lose you through my own cowardice. I believe you, Alira said softly, and found, as she said it, that she truly did. Alden Marsh continued to make occasional appearances during these days, always polite, always offering assistance, that Alira found herself trusting less with each interaction. She noticed, with growing suspicion, that his questions often circled back to specific details about the archive, about exactly what she and Cale had discovered, about the nature of Celine's binding, phrased always as concern for her safety, but carrying, underneath, a hunger for information that felt distinctly out of place for a man simply worried about a young bride's well-being. She mentioned her suspicions to Cale one evening, and watched his expression grow thoughtful and troubled in response. Alden has served as chief advisor since before my father's death, Cale said slowly. He guided me through my early years on the throne, when I had no one else to trust. I have never had reason to doubt his loyalty, but you are not the first to raise concerns about him, Alira. Roan mentioned something similar to me only recently, and now you as well. Perhaps it is time to watch him more carefully, Alira suggested. Perhaps it is, Cale agreed, his jaw tightening with new resolve. I will have Roan quietly monitor his movements. If Alden is hiding something, I intend to uncover it before it can cause further harm. That night, as Alira prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not of the shadow presence, or Bastion's grim revelations, or even Alden's suspicious behavior, but of the steady warmth that had grown between herself and Cale over the past several days, a warmth that felt, despite every danger surrounding it, remarkably real and remarkably earned. She thought of his promise beneath the flowering tree, his vow never to retreat from her the way the Fifth King had retreated from Corinne, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a future where that promise held true, where she became not the 10th tragedy on a long grieving list, but the first genuine triumph in a story that had waited far too long to find its happy ending. Outside her window, the mountains stood silent beneath a clear night sky, and somewhere deep within the ancient stones of the Black Citadel, the presence that had claimed 9 lives before hers waited patiently, watching, testing, and preparing, Alira suspected, for a far greater trial than the simple warning it had delivered on that first terrifying night. Whatever came next, she understood now, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her. She would not face it by retreating into fear. She would face it exactly as she and Cale had promised each other, together, honestly, and without the cowardice that had doomed every attempt before their own. Roan found Alira in the library 3 days later, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately set her nerves on edge. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking, checking the empty corridor beyond the library door, and lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. I followed Alden Marsh last night, he said. He left the Citadel after midnight, alone, and rode north for nearly 2 hours, before I lost his trail in the hills. I do not know where he went, but I do know it was not anywhere within his usual duties as chief advisor. Alira's pulse quickened. North? Toward the old Coven lands? I believe so, Roan confirmed. I have already reported this to His Majesty. He wishes to speak with you both together, immediately. They found Cale in his private study, pacing the length of the room with barely contained tension, and when Alira entered, he stopped immediately, crossing to her side with an urgency that spoke louder than any words could have managed. Rowan told you? He did, Alira said. You think Alden has some connection to the Coven's remaining lands? I think it is worth investigating directly, Cale said. If Alden has been traveling north under secrecy, and if his interest in our discoveries in the archive has been as pointed as both you and Roan believe, then perhaps he knows something about Celine's binding, that he has deliberately kept hidden from the throne for reasons of his own. What reasons could he possibly have for wanting the curse to continue? Alira asked. Cale's expression darkened. Power, perhaps. As chief advisor, Alden has held tremendous influence over this throne for decades, guiding decisions, controlling access to the king, shaping policy in ways that have benefited him personally, as much as the crown itself. A king distracted by grief, by the constant threat of losing yet another bride, is a king who leans heavily on his advisors for support and decision-making, a king who successfully breaks the curse, who builds a stable, trusted partnership with his queen, may have far less need for an advisor's constant guidance. The theory settled uncomfortably in Alira's mind, fitting too neatly with everything she had already observed about Alden's behavior. His too smooth reassurances, his pointed questions about the archive, his sudden appearance at exactly the moment she had discovered the sealed door leading down into it. "We need proof," she said. "Suspicion alone will not be enough to move against a man who has served this throne for decades." "Agreed," Cale said. "Rowan, can you continue monitoring his movements without raising suspicion?" "I can try, Your Majesty," Rowan said. "Though if he traveled north again, following him without detection, through unfamiliar terrain, will prove more difficult." "Then we need another approach," Elira said, an idea beginning to form in her mind. "What if I speak with him directly? Not with accusations, but with careful questions, framed as genuine curiosity about the archive, about Celine's history. If he is hiding something, perhaps I can draw out details he would not otherwise reveal, simply by giving him the opening to correct or contradict what we already know." Cale's expression filled with immediate concern. "That could be dangerous, Elira. If he suspects you are testing him, and if he truly does have some hand in maintaining this curse, there is no telling what he might do to protect his position." "I will be careful," Elira promised, "and I will not meet with him alone, not truly. Roan can remain nearby, within earshot, in case anything goes wrong." After some further discussion, and considerable reluctance on Cale's part, the plan was agreed upon, and that very afternoon, Elira arranged to encounter Alden in the long gallery, where his usual afternoon walk through the citadel typically passed. He greeted her with his customary smooth smile, though something in his eyes seemed sharper than usual, more calculating. "Miss Voss, I trust you are recovering well from your ordeal." "I am, thank you," Elira said, keeping her tone light and conversational. "Actually, I am glad to have found you. I have been continuing my research into the Citadel's history, and I have found myself curious about the coven that once lived in the northern hills. Celine, I believe her name was. Have you heard of her?" Something flickered across Alden's face, quickly smoothed away, but not quite quickly enough for Elira to miss it entirely. "A distant historical footnote," he said carefully. "Long before my time serving this throne, of course." "Of course," Elira said, watching him closely. "It's strange, though. I found records suggesting her people may not have been entirely wiped out, as most historical accounts claim. Do you know if any of her descendants might still live in the region today?" Alden's smile remained fixed in place, but his eyes had gone cold and watchful. "I could not say, Miss Voss. Such matters fall well outside the scope of my duties as chief advisor." "May I ask why this particular piece of ancient history interests you so specifically?" "Simple curiosity," Elira said lightly. "The king and I have been exploring the Citadel's history together. It seemed a natural subject to pursue, given everything that has happened to previous brides." "A wise king learns to leave certain old histories buried," Alden said, his tone still smooth but carrying now an unmistakable edge of warning. "Digging too deeply into matters better left forgotten has a way of inviting consequences no one intended or wanted, Miss Voss. I would encourage you to focus instead on more pleasant pursuits, for your own safety." The conversation ended shortly after, Alden excusing himself with a polite bow that felt, to Elira, far more like a dismissal than genuine courtesy. She found Roan waiting for her a short distance down the corridor, his expression grim. "You heard?" she asked. "Enough," Roan confirmed. His reaction when you mentioned Celine's descendants was not the reaction of a man who considers this simple ancient history. That evening, Elira relayed the full conversation to Cale, watching his expression grow increasingly troubled as she described Alden's careful, calculated responses. "He knows something," Cale said finally. "Perhaps he even knows whether Celine's coven truly ended, or whether some part of it survives, hidden away in those northern hills." "If it does survive," Elira said slowly, working through the implications as she spoke, "perhaps that is where Alden has been traveling. Perhaps he has been in contact with descendants of the coven, for reasons we do not yet fully understand." Cale's jaw tightened. "Then we need to know for certain. Roan, I want a full contingent, ready to travel north at first light. If there is truth to this, I intend to find it myself, directly, rather than relying on second-hand suspicion any longer." "I want to come with you," Elira said immediately. Cale turned to her, his expression torn between the instinct to protect her by leaving her safely behind, and the growing understanding that keeping her at a careful distance had never once protected any bride before her. Finally he nodded, slowly, decisively. Very well. But you remain close to me at all times, and you follow every instruction given, without hesitation. Understood? Understood, Illyra agreed, relief and apprehension mingling together in her chest, at the thought of finally moving forward, actively, toward whatever truth waited in the northern hills. They departed before dawn the following morning, a small, carefully chosen party consisting of Kale, Illyra, Roan, and 2 additional trusted guards, moving quickly and quietly to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the rest of the Citadel staff, particularly Alden, who had conveniently claimed urgent business elsewhere that morning that kept him occupied and unaware of their departure. The journey north proved difficult, the terrain growing rougher and wilder the further they traveled from the Citadel's familiar grounds, until finally, after several hours of steady riding, they reached the edge of a small, hidden valley, tucked between 2 steep hills, invisible from any of the main roads that crossed the territory. Smoke rose faintly from somewhere within the valley, suggesting habitation, despite the region's supposed abandonment decades earlier. "Someone lives here," Roan said quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword as they dismounted and approached carefully on foot. They found the settlement nestled among old, twisted trees, a small collection of simple wooden dwellings that had clearly been maintained and inhabited for generations, far from the notice of the wider territory. As they approached, several figures emerged from the dwellings, watching their approach with wary, guarded expressions, and at the front of the small gathering stood an older woman, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes carrying an intensity that reminded Illyra immediately, and unmistakably, of the fierce, grieving voice she had read in Celine's journal. "You should not have come here," the woman said, her voice carrying an authority that silenced even Kale's usual royal composure for a long moment. "This valley has remained hidden from Draven eyes for good reason." "I am Kale Draven," Kale said, stepping forward carefully, his hands open and non-threatening at his sides. "I mean no harm to your people. I have only recently learned the truth of what my great-grandfather did to your ancestor Celine, and the binding she placed upon my bloodline as a result. I have come seeking understanding, and perhaps, if it is possible, a way to finally set things right." The older woman studied him for a long, silent moment, her eyes sharp and assessing, before finally turning her attention to Illyra standing beside him. "And you are the 10th. "I am," Illyra confirmed, holding the woman's gaze steadily, despite the fear still fluttering in her chest. "I am Marguerite," the woman said finally, "Celine's granddaughter, many generations removed. I have watched, from this valley, every selection that has passed in the last several decades, waiting to see whether any king would ever come seeking genuine understanding, rather than simply enduring the curse in grieving silence, as his predecessors did. You are the first to come here directly, Kale Draven. In all the years I have kept this watch." "Then perhaps that means something," Kale said carefully. "Perhaps it means we are finally ready to end this cycle properly, rather than allowing it to continue claiming lives that were never meant to pay for a debt they did not create." Marguerite's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained clearly visible beneath the surface. "Come," she said finally. "There is much you both need to understand, and precious little time remaining before the presence within your citadel grows too strong to reason with at all." She led them toward the largest dwelling at the center of the small settlement, and as Illyra followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and cautious hope, she understood that whatever truth waited inside, it would likely determine not only her own survival, but the fate of an entire bloodline burdened by generations of broken promises and unresolved grief. Inside the dwelling, the air was warm and smelled faintly of dried herbs and burning cedar. Marguerite gestured for them to sit around a low wooden table, and she settled across from them with the careful, measured movements of someone accustomed to holding difficult conversations. Several other members of the settlement lingered near the doorway, watching silently, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. "My grandmother's grandmother bound your bloodline out of grief and fury," Marguerite began. "But I want you both to understand something that even Celine's own journal may not have fully expressed. She did not create this binding out of a desire for endless cruelty. She created it because she believed, in her heart, that the Draven line was capable of better, and she wanted a way to ensure that belief was eventually tested and proven, even if it took generations to accomplish. Then you know how the binding can be broken, Cale said, leaning forward with barely restrained urgency. I know what my grandmother believed, Marguerite corrected gently. Whether her belief holds true remains to be seen, since no king and bride before you have ever come close enough to test it fully. The binding requires loyalty freely given, tested and unbroken through genuine hardship, not simply affection built in comfort and safety. It requires you both to face the presence directly, together, at its strongest, and to choose each other, despite every instinct urging you toward fear and retreat. What does facing it directly mean? Alira asked. We already survived one attack. Was that not enough? Marguerite shook her head slowly. That was only a test of initial resolve, a probing attack meant to gauge your reaction. The true trial comes later, when the bond between you has grown strong enough that losing it would cause genuine devastation. The presence will not simply test whether you can survive a moment of fear. It will test whether your loyalty holds, even when the cost of maintaining it feels unbearable. Alira felt a chill move through her at these words, understanding immediately the weight of what Marguerite was describing. The 9 brides before her had likely died, not during simple, isolated attacks, but during moments when the presence had escalated its trials beyond what their bond with the king could withstand. Is there anything you can teach us? Cale asked. Any preparation? Any knowledge that might help us survive when that final trial comes? Marguerite was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between them, with an expression that carried both hope and deep uncertainty. There are old protective measures my people have maintained, passed down through generations, meant to strengthen a bond against exactly this kind of trial. I can teach you some of these measures, though I want to be honest with you both. My grandmother's binding was born from genuine grief and betrayal, and grief of that magnitude does not simply dissolve because a king finally seeks understanding, generations later. The presence within your citadel has grown, over the decades, feeding on repeated failure, repeated loss. It may not release its hold easily, even if you succeed in proving genuine loyalty. We understand the risk, Alira said firmly, glancing at Cale, who nodded in solemn agreement beside her. We would rather try honestly and fail than continue living in fear, watching another cycle of tragedy repeat itself, without ever attempting to break it. Something in Marguerite's expression shifted then, a flicker of genuine respect replacing some of her earlier wariness. Very well, she said. I will teach you what I can. But first, I must ask you something important. Cale Draven, your advisor, the one called Alden Marsh. What is his connection to your throne? Cale's expression sharpened with immediate interest. He is my chief advisor, and has been for many years. We have reason to believe he has been traveling to this region secretly, without explanation. Do you know him? Marguerite's expression darkened considerably. He has visited this valley before, several times over the years, always alone, always asking careful questions about the nature of Celine's binding, about whether it could be strengthened or extended, rather than broken. I did not trust his intentions then, and I trust them even less now, hearing that he has been actively discouraging your bride from pursuing the truth. The revelation confirmed every suspicion Alira and Cale had already begun forming, and it settled a cold, hard certainty in Alira's chest. Alden Marsh was not simply a cautious advisor grieving past losses. He had been actively working to ensure the curse continued, for reasons that remained unclear, but were clearly serving his own interests, rather than the well-being of the throne he claimed to serve so faithfully. Why would he want the curse to continue? Alira asked. What could he possibly gain from 9 women dying? That, I cannot answer with certainty, Marguerite said, but I have long suspected that a king bound by grief, dependent on his advisors for guidance and stability, is far easier to control than a king who has found genuine partnership and strength in a lasting union. Perhaps your advisor has grown comfortable with the influence your grief has afforded him over the years, and fears what your success might mean for his own position. Cale's expression hardened into something colder and more determined than Alira had yet seen from him. Then he will answer for it, once we return to the citadel. But first, teach us what you can, Marguerite. We have precious little time before the final trial arrives, and I intend to face it prepared, rather than caught unaware, the way every king before me has been. Marguerite nodded, and for the next several hours, she guided them through old protective rituals, teachings, passed down through generations of her family, meant to strengthen the bond between 2 people facing a trial designed to test the very limits of their loyalty. She taught them a ritual of binding intention, spoken vows exchanged not out of tradition or obligation, but genuine, freely given choice, meant to anchor their connection against whatever the presence might attempt to unleash against them. By the time they finally prepared to depart back toward the citadel, the sun had begun sinking low over the western hills, casting long golden light across the small hidden valley. Marguerite walked with them to the edge of the settlement, her expression carrying a mixture of hope and lingering worry. "I wish you both success," she said finally. "My grandmother's grief deserves resolution, not endless repetition. If you succeed where 9 before you have failed, it will mean more than simply saving your own lives. It will mean, finally, that her voice was heard, and that the promise broken so long ago has at last, in some small way, been honored. We will not let her sacrifice, or the sacrifice of the 9 brides before me, be in vain," Elira said firmly, and Marguerite's eyes glistened briefly with unshed tears, before she nodded and stepped back, watching as their small party mounted their horses and began the long ride back toward the Black Citadel. As the hidden valley disappeared behind them into the gathering dusk, Elira felt Cale's hand find hers once more, steady and certain, and though the trial ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty and danger, she found herself facing it not with the paralyzing fear that had gripped her on that first terrible night in the citadel, but with a quiet, determined resolve that surprised even herself. Whatever waited for them within those ancient black walls, she intended to meet it standing beside Cale, not retreating from him, and together, she believed, truly believed for the first time, that they might finally break a cycle of grief that had claimed 9 lives before hers, and prove, once and for all, that Celine's shattered trust could still be restored. The citadel gates loomed dark against the night sky as their small party finally returned, exhausted from the long ride, but the moment they crossed into the courtyard, Elira sensed immediately that something had shifted in their absence. The usual guards stationed near the entrance were nowhere to be seen, and an unnatural stillness hung over the entire fortress, as though the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something. "Something is wrong," Roan said quietly, his hand already moving to his sword. They moved quickly through the main hall, finding it empty and dimly lit, most of the torches burned down to barely flickering embers. Cale's expression grew increasingly grim as they searched further, finding the kitchens abandoned mid-preparation, dishes left scattered across the counters as though the staff had fled in sudden haste. "Petra," Elira breathed, fear gripping her chest. "Where is everyone?" They found Petra eventually, huddled in a small storage room off the main kitchen, her eyes wide with terror, and when she saw Cale and Elira, relief flooded her expression so completely that she nearly collapsed against the doorframe. "Your Majesty, thank goodness," Petra gasped. "It came again, shortly after you left, stronger than before. Everyone fled to the lower servant quarters for safety. Lord Marsh instructed everyone to remain hidden until it was safe to emerge." "Alden gave that instruction?" Cale asked sharply. "Yes, Your Majesty. He said the presence was searching specifically for Miss Voss, and that everyone else should stay well clear until it either found what it was looking for or grew tired of searching." A cold, furious understanding settled over Elira as she processed Petra's words. If the presence had indeed grown stronger and more aggressive in their absence, and if Alden had specifically instructed everyone to stay hidden rather than seeking help or attempting to protect the citadel, it suggested he had either known the attack was coming or had done nothing to prevent it once it began, content to let events play out however they might. "Where is Alden now?" Cale demanded. "I do not know, Your Majesty. He left the servant quarters sometime after giving his instructions and did not return." Cale's jaw tightened with barely restrained fury. "Roan, gather every available guard. I want the entire citadel searched, and I want Alden Marsh found immediately." As Roan departed to carry out the order, a sudden bone-deep chill swept through the kitchen, extinguishing the remaining torches in an instant and plunging the room into near-total darkness. Petra screamed, scrambling further back into the storage room, and Elira felt Cale's arm wrap protectively around her shoulders as the temperature continued dropping with unnatural speed. The shadow presence materialized at the far end of the kitchen, larger and more defined than it had appeared during the first attack, its formless edges now carrying faint hints of a humanoid shape, as though it had grown stronger, more solidified, during the days of their absence. You returned. The voice pressed into their minds, colder and more resonant than before. You sought help from the old ones. Foolish. Their teachings will not save you from what comes next. We are not seeking to escape this trial, Kale said firmly, stepping forward slightly, positioning himself between the presence and both Illyra and Petra. We are seeking to face it honestly, together, exactly as Selene intended when she created this binding in the first place. The presence seemed to pause at this, its formless mass shifting and rippling, as though considering Kale's words carefully. Then it moved suddenly, faster than either of them anticipated, closing the distance between itself and Illyra in the span of a single heartbeat. Illyra felt icy fingers close around her wrist, though no physical hand was visible, the sensation somehow both immaterial and undeniably real. Pain shot up her arm, and she cried out, but before the presence could pull her further, Kale moved instinctively, grabbing her other hand and holding firm, refusing to let go despite the visible strain the effort seemed to cause him. I will not release her, Kale said through gritted teeth, his own eyes flashing with that same dangerous amber light Illyra had witnessed during the first attack. Not to fear, not to grief, not to anything. She is not yours to take. The struggle seemed to last only seconds, though it felt to Illyra like an eternity, her arm burning with cold, invisible pain, while Kale's grip remained steady and unyielding on her other hand. Finally, with a sound like a furious, frustrated exhale, the presence released its grip and retreated, its formless shape dissolving back into the shadows of the kitchen, though not before its cold voice pressed one final warning into both their minds. This is only the beginning. The true trial has not yet come. Prepare yourselves, 10th bride, for what follows will demand far more than simple resolve. The kitchen fell silent once the presence had fully retreated, the temperature slowly beginning to normalize, and Illyra sank against Kale's chest, her legs trembling too badly to support her fully on her own. He held her steady, his own breathing ragged with the effort of the confrontation, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply grateful to have survived the encounter together. We need to find Alden, Kale said finally, once he had confirmed Illyra was steady enough to stand on her own. Now, before he can cause further harm. They found him nearly an hour later, in his private study on the 3rd floor, calmly sorting through a stack of papers, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all within the citadel that evening. His expression, upon seeing them enter, flickered briefly, with something like surprise, before settling back into his usual practiced composure. Your Majesty, Miss Voss, I am relieved to see you both safely returned. Where were you during the attack? Kale demanded, his voice carrying an edge Illyra had never heard him use with his advisor before. I instructed the staff to seek safety, as I have always done during such incidents, Alden said smoothly. I myself retreated to secure the important records in this study, given their historical significance. You knew we had traveled north, Kale said, his voice growing dangerously quiet. You know about Marguerite, about her people, about your own visits to that hidden valley over the years. Do not insult me by pretending otherwise. For the first time since Illyra had met him, Alden's composed expression cracked, just slightly, a flicker of genuine alarm passing across his features, before he managed to smooth it away again. I do not know what you believe you have learned, Your Majesty, but I assure you, my only interest has ever been the stability and continuation of this throne. Stability, built on 9 deaths, Illyra said sharply, unable to contain her fury any longer. You have been discouraging every attempt to break this curse, haven't you? Because a king consumed by grief, dependent on your guidance, serves your interests far better than a king who finds genuine happiness and partnership. Alden's expression hardened, the mask of smooth courtesy finally slipping away entirely, revealing something colder and more calculating underneath. You understand nothing of what you speak, Miss Voss. Do you truly believe the throne could have survived these past decades without careful, steady guidance, without someone willing to make the difficult decisions a grieving king could not bring himself to make alone? So you admit it, Kale said, his voice low and dangerous. You have known the truth of Selene's binding all along, and you chose to let 9 women die, rather than risk losing your influence over this throne. I chose to protect this kingdom from the chaos of an untested king, acting on dangerous, uncertain hope, Alden shot back, his composure fully abandoned now. Celine's binding, if broken carelessly, could unleash consequences none of us fully understand. I have spent decades managing that risk carefully, ensuring this throne survived each tragedy, with minimal disruption to the wider territory. You call it cruelty. I call it responsibility. You call it responsibility, Illyra said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. While 9 women died believing they were simply unlucky victims of an uncontrollable curse, when in truth, you were actively working to ensure that curse could never be broken. Alden's eyes flashed with something like genuine fury now, the careful mask completely gone. And what do you imagine will happen, Miss Voss, when you finally break this binding, if you even manage to survive long enough to attempt it? Do you believe the presence simply vanishes, harmless and forgotten? Celine's coven bound something ancient and powerful to this bloodline. I have spent years studying the full nature of that binding, and I promise you, breaking it carries risks far greater than either of you currently understand. Then explain them to us, Cale demanded. If you truly believed you were protecting this kingdom, prove it now. Tell us exactly what you know. For a long, tense moment, Alden simply stared at them both, something calculating shifting behind his eyes, as he clearly weighed his remaining options. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he swept the stack of papers from his desk and lunged toward a hidden compartment behind one of the study's bookshelves, clearly intending to retrieve or destroy something before they could stop him. Roan, who had entered the study only moments before and remained silently watchful near the doorway, moved with startling speed, catching Alden's arm before he could reach the compartment and forcing him back with practiced, controlled strength. I think, Roan said grimly, it is time you told us everything, Lord Marsh, whether you intended to or not. Alden struggled briefly against Roan's grip, before finally sagging, defeated, all the fight draining out of him at once. Cale crossed the room and opened the hidden compartment himself, revealing a small collection of documents and a single, ornate box carved from dark wood, its surface etched with symbols matching the one Illyra had seen in Celine's journal and on the ancestor's portrait in the long gallery. What is this? Cale asked, lifting the box carefully. A fragment of the original binding, Alden admitted, his voice hollow now that pretense had abandoned him entirely. I discovered it years ago, hidden within these very walls, and I have kept it secret ever since. It allows a measure of influence over the presence, a way to direct its attention, to some degree, though never full control. Illyra's eyes widened with sudden horrified understanding. You have been using it. You have been deliberately provoking the presence against the brides. Not provoking, Alden said quickly, though the denial rang hollow even to his own ears, judging by the way his voice wavered. Only managing, ensuring the trials proceeded in a manner I could predict, rather than allowing full chaos to unfold unchecked. You have been murdering my brides, Cale said, his voice shaking now with a fury more terrible than anything Illyra had yet witnessed from him. For years, while pretending to grieve alongside me, while pretending to counsel caution out of genuine concern, you were the one directing their deaths. I never intended for it to go this far, Alden said, his composure finally shattering completely, tears actually forming in his eyes now. It began as a way to simply observe the presence more closely, to understand its patterns, its triggers. But once I realized the influence it granted me over the throne's stability, I confess I grew comfortable with the arrangement. I told myself I was protecting the kingdom from the chaos of a king destroyed by repeated grief, but in truth, you like the power, Illyra finished for him, disgust clear in her voice. Alden did not deny it, his silence confirming the accusation more completely than any words could have managed. Cale set the ornate box down carefully on the desk, his hands trembling with barely restrained fury, and turned to face his advisor with an expression of such profound betrayal that even Alden seemed to flinch beneath its weight. You will be held for this, Cale said, his voice cold and final. Every death, every year of grief, you allowed to continue unnecessarily, will be accounted for. Roan, take him to the lower cells. He will remain there until I decide how justice will be served. As Roan led the broken, silent Alden from the study, Illyra moved closer to examine the ornate box Cale had set down, her curiosity mingling with a deep, unsettled dread at the thought of what such an object might truly be capable of. Do you think this could help us? If it grants some measure of influence over the presence, perhaps we could use it to prepare for whatever final trial awaits, rather than simply trying to survive it blindly. Cale's expression turned thoughtful, though clearly still shaken by the depth of Alden's betrayal. Perhaps, though I confess, I am wary of relying on the same tool that allowed 9 deaths to occur under its influence. We should examine it carefully, and perhaps consult Marguerite again, before attempting to use it ourselves. They spent the remainder of that night together in the study, carefully documenting everything Alden's hidden compartment had contained, piecing together a clearer picture of exactly how deeply his betrayal had shaped the tragic pattern of the past decade. Letters revealed correspondence with unknown parties, hints of financial gain tied to his continued influence over the throne, and detailed notes tracking each bride's emotional state in the days leading up to her death, evidence that Alden had indeed been actively monitoring, and likely manipulating, the presence's attacks all along. By the time dawn finally broke over the mountains, both Alira and Cale were exhausted, physically and emotionally, from the events of the day. Yet beneath that exhaustion, Alira felt something else stirring as well, a fierce, determined relief at finally understanding the true source of so much unnecessary suffering. The presence itself remained a genuine, ancient danger, born from real grief and betrayal generations ago, but Alden's manipulation had compounded that danger unnecessarily, turning survivable trials into guaranteed tragedies through his own selfish interference. With him removed, Alira said quietly, as the first light of morning began filtering through the study's tall windows, perhaps we finally have a fair chance. No more hidden manipulation working against us from within these very walls. A fair chance, Cale agreed, though the weariness in his voice carried an undertone of renewed determination as well. It is more than any king before me has ever had. We will not waste it. He reached for her hand once more, and though the night had been long and terrible in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated, Alira found, as their fingers intertwined, a steady, growing certainty settling into her chest. The path ahead remained dangerous, the final trial Marguerite had warned them about still looming somewhere in their near future, but for the first time since her arrival at the Black Citadel, Alira believed, truly and completely, that she and Cale might finally stand a genuine chance of breaking a cycle of grief that had claimed far too many lives already, and that whatever came next, they would face it honestly, together, and without the hidden treachery that had doomed every attempt before their own. Marguerite arrived at the Citadel 3 days later, summoned by Cale himself, her presence within the ancient black walls marking the first time in generations that a descendant of Celine's coven had willingly entered the very fortress her ancestor had cursed so long ago. She moved through the corridors with careful, measured steps, her eyes taking in every detail with an intensity that suggested she was seeing far more than simple stone and shadow. "The presence has grown stronger since I last sensed it from my valley," she said, once she had settled into the private study where Cale and Alira waited for her. "Your confrontation with your advisor's stolen influence and his subsequent removal has shifted something. I believe the true trial approaches faster than any of us anticipated." "How much time do we have?" Cale asked. "Days, perhaps. No more than a week, I would guess, though I cannot be entirely certain." Marguerite's expression grew serious as she withdrew a small pouch from within her cloak, along with the ornate box Cale had recovered from Alden's hidden compartment. "May I examine this?" Cale nodded, and Marguerite opened the box carefully, revealing a small, dark stone nestled within, etched with the same symbol that had appeared throughout their investigation. She studied it for a long moment, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This fragment was never meant to grant control over the presence," she said finally. "It was meant only as a warning mechanism, a way for the coven itself to monitor the binding's progress from a distance, to know when a king and bride were approaching the final trial, so that guidance could be offered if needed. Your advisor twisted its purpose into something far darker, using it to actively provoke and direct the presence's attacks, rather than simply observing them. Can it still serve its original purpose?" Alira asked. "Could we use it to prepare properly for what's coming?" Marguerite considered this carefully. "Perhaps. Though I would caution against relying on it too heavily. The final trial, when it comes, will not be something easily predicted or controlled through any external tool. It will test the very foundation of what you have built together, directly and without warning, and no stone or symbol will protect you. if that foundation proves too fragile to withstand the pressure. Over the following days, Marguerite remained at the Citadel, guiding Alira and Kale through additional preparations, teaching them protective rituals passed down through generations of her family, and sharing what fragmentary knowledge remained of previous, failed attempts to satisfy Celine's binding. Alira found herself growing to respect the older woman deeply, recognizing in her the same fierce protective determination that had driven Celine herself to create the binding in the first place, tempered now by generations of watching that same binding cause unintended suffering. "My grandmother's grandmother would be glad to see you both trying so genuinely," Marguerite said one evening, as they sat together in the eastern gardens beneath Kale's mother's flowering tree. "Whatever happens in the final trial, know that your effort alone honors what she truly wanted, far more than any king before you has managed." "I hope effort will be enough," Alira said quietly, watching the last light of sunset filter through the branches above them. "It rarely is, on its own," Marguerite admitted honestly, "but paired with genuine loyalty, freely chosen despite every reason to retreat instead, it stands a far better chance than anything attempted before." That night, Alira found herself unable to sleep, her mind turning over every detail of their preparation, every warning Marguerite had offered, every fragment of knowledge they had gathered about the presence and its origins. She rose eventually, and made her way toward the eastern gardens, finding, unsurprisingly, that Kale had also been unable to rest, sitting alone on the stone bench beneath his mother's tree, staring up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling beside him. "Too many thoughts," he admitted, "mostly of my mother, tonight. I keep thinking of what she might say, if she could see what has become of this house since her death. The grief, the betrayal, the years wasted under Alden's hidden manipulation. I wonder if she would recognize the man I have become, trying so desperately now to undo what generations before me allowed to fester." "I think she would be proud," Alira said softly. "Proud that you finally chose to fight for something real, rather than simply enduring what was handed to you." Kale turned to look at her, moonlight catching in his dark eyes, and something in his expression shifted, softening into an openness that felt, in that quiet moment, more vulnerable than anything she had yet witnessed from him. "I never expected this," he said quietly. "When the selection bell rang and your name was drawn, I prepared myself for another death, another name added to a list I already carried too heavily. I did not expect to find someone who would refuse to simply accept that fate, who would push back against every careful wall I had built, and who would somehow, despite everything, make me want to try again, genuinely, for the first time in years." "I didn't expect any of this either," Alira admitted, "but I'm glad it happened this way. Whatever comes in the final trial, I don't regret choosing to face it honestly, with you, rather than simply accepting the fear that was handed to me." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the weight of everything ahead of them, somehow feeling more bearable, in the shared quiet of the garden, beneath stars, that had witnessed generations of grief within these ancient walls, and now, perhaps, witnessed something different, beginning to take root instead. 2 days later, the final trial arrived without warning, exactly as Marguerite had predicted it might. Alira and Kale had spent the afternoon in the training yard, Kale teaching her basic self-defense techniques at her own insistence, both of them laughing more freely than either had allowed themselves to in longer than they could remember, when the temperature suddenly plummeted without warning, the sky above the Citadel darkening despite the early hour, clouds gathering with unnatural speed directly overhead. "It's here," Kale said grimly, immediately positioning himself protectively beside Alira as guards began pouring into the courtyard, drawn by the sudden, alarming shift in weather. The presence manifested at the center of the courtyard itself this time, larger and more fully formed than either previous encounter, its shape now clearly humanoid, though still composed entirely of shifting, formless shadow, its presence radiating a cold so absolute it seemed to drain the very warmth from the air itself. "10th Bride," its voice pressed into both their minds simultaneously, resonant and ancient. "The time has come to test what you have built, not through fear alone, but through loss, true and absolute. Only then will I know whether your loyalty holds, or whether it shatters, as every loyalty before it has shattered." Before either of them could respond, the presence surged forward with terrible speed, and Alira felt herself lifted bodily into the air, invisible force wrapping around her entire body, lifting her far above the courtyard toward the darkened sky. She screamed, and below her, she heard Cale's voice roaring in fury and desperation, watched him running forward, reaching upward uselessly toward her rapidly ascending form. Alira! The presence's cold voice pressed once more into her mind, as she rose higher, the citadel shrinking beneath her, the mountains spreading out in every direction. This is the final trial. Choose, Cale Draven. Save her yourself, without relying on the tools of the old ones, without the stone your advisor stole and twisted for his own purposes, or lose her exactly as you have lost 9 others before her. True loyalty requires sacrifice freely given, not tools relied upon to avoid the cost entirely. Marguerite's voice rang out from below, urgent and commanding, reaching Cale just as he prepared. Alira could see, even from her terrifying height, to reach for the small pouch containing the ornate stone still tucked at his belt. No! If you use it now, you fail the trial entirely. This must be faced with nothing but what exists between you both, freely and without external aid. Alira watched, suspended impossibly high above the citadel, cold wind tearing at her clothes and hair, as Cale hesitated for one agonizing moment, his hand frozen near the pouch at his belt, torn between the desperate desire to use any tool available to save her, and the growing understanding that doing so would guarantee the very failure he was trying to prevent. Then, with a visible act of will, he released the pouch entirely, letting his hand fall away, and instead closed his eyes, raising both arms toward the sky, toward her, and began speaking words Alira could barely hear from her great height, though she recognized, faintly, the shape of the binding ritual Marguerite had taught them both in the hidden valley, words of genuine, freely given loyalty, spoken not as a desperate bargain but as an honest declaration. I choose her, Cale's voice rose, carried somehow clearly up through the impossible distance between them, growing stronger with each word, not out of obligation, not out of fear of failure, not out of desperate need to avoid another loss added to a list I already carry. I choose Alira Voss because she is who I want beside me, freely, completely, for exactly who she is, and I would rather face this trial honestly, and lose her, than win her safety through anything less than the truth of what I feel. The presence's grip on Alira seemed to falter slightly at these words, its formless shape rippling with what almost looked like uncertainty, and Alira, understanding instinctively what was needed from her in this moment, forced her own trembling voice to carry down through the cold, rushing wind. I choose him too, she called out, her voice shaking but growing steadier with each word, not because I have no other choice, not because refusing means death for my family, but because in this place built on grief and broken promises, I found someone willing to try, genuinely, to be better than the history that shaped him. I choose Cale Draven, freely, and I am not afraid to fall, if falling means proving that this bloodline is finally capable of the loyalty your ancestor was so cruelly denied. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened at all, Alira hanging impossibly still in the freezing air, the entire courtyard below holding its collective breath. Then, the invisible force gripping her body released all at once, and she began falling, the ground rushing up terrifyingly fast beneath her, and she heard, distantly, Cale's anguished cry as he ran forward, arms outstretched, desperately trying to close the impossible distance between them in time. Time seemed to slow in a way that felt impossible, every heartbeat stretching into an eternity, as Alira fell, the courtyard stones rushing closer with terrifying speed. She heard Marguerite's voice crying out words in an old language, saw the ornate stone Cale had refused to use, now glowing faintly at his belt on its own, as though responding to the genuine sacrifice offered, rather than the desperate manipulation Alden had once forced from it. And then, impossibly, the air itself seemed to thicken around her, slowing her descent just enough that when Cale finally reached the point of impact, throwing himself forward with everything he had, he caught her safely in his arms, both of them tumbling together onto the stone ground, with far less force than the fall should have carried. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both gasping for breath, Cale's arms wrapped so tightly around her that Alira could feel his heart hammering against her own chest. Then, slowly, carefully, he pulled back just enough to look at her face, his eyes wide with a fear that had not yet fully released its grip on him. Alira, he breathed, his voice raw. Are you hurt? Please, tell me you are not hurt. I'm all right, she managed, her own voice shaking badly. I'm all right, Kale. Around them, the entire courtyard had fallen into stunned silence, the dark clouds overhead beginning, slowly, to part, allowing thin streams of sunlight to break through for the first time since the trial had begun. The formless shadow presence remained visible at the center of the courtyard, though its shape had grown noticeably less solid, more uncertain, as though something fundamental had shifted within it. You chose, its voice pressed into their minds once more, quieter now, less resonant with ancient fury. Both of you, freely, without relying on tools or tricks to avoid the true cost of the trial. This has not happened before. Then release this bloodline from Celine's grief, Kale said, rising carefully to his feet, still holding Alira close beside him, his voice steady despite everything they had just endured. You have tested us honestly, and we have answered honestly. 9 women died because those before me could not offer what you demanded. We offer it now, freely, without reservation. The presence seemed to consider this for a long, suspended moment, its formless shape rippling and shifting, and then, unexpectedly, another voice joined the exchange, different from the cold, hollow tone of the presence itself, warmer, older, carrying an unmistakable note of long, weary grief, finally beginning to ease. I did not create you to punish endlessly, the new voice said, and Alira understood, with a sudden, startling clarity, that they were hearing Celine herself, somehow still connected to the ancient binding, even after so many generations had passed. I created you to test whether genuine trust could still exist within a bloodline that broke my people's trust so completely. I have waited longer than I ever intended for that test to finally be answered honestly. You have answered it now, both of you, and I find myself, after so many years of grief, finally willing to believe that trust broken so long ago can, in fact, be rebuilt. The formless shadow presence began to dissolve then, not violently or suddenly, but slowly, gently, like mist burning away beneath the returning morning sun, and as it dissolved, the oppressive cold that had gripped the entire citadel for as long as anyone could remember seemed to lift as well, replaced by a warmth that felt, to Alira, almost like the courtyard itself was finally exhaling a breath it had been holding for generations. Marguerite approached them slowly, tears streaming freely down her weathered face, her expression a complex mixture of grief and profound relief. It is done, she said softly. The binding is finally released. My grandmother's grandmother can finally rest, knowing her people's trust has, at last, been genuinely honored. Kale turned to Alira, disbelief and overwhelming relief warring across his features, and without hesitation, he pulled her close once more, pressing his forehead gently against hers. You are alive, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are truly, finally, safely alive, and this house is finally free. We did it, Alira managed, laughter and tears mixing together in her voice, as the full weight of everything they had survived finally began settling over her. Kale, we actually did it. The remaining guards and staff who had witnessed the entire trial began to cheer and weep in equal measure, the accumulated grief of decades finally finding release in the courtyard's newly warmed air. Petra rushed forward, embracing Alira tightly, sobbing openly with relief, while Roan stood nearby, his usually stoic expression cracked wide open with visible emotion as he watched his king finally freed from a burden that had shaped his entire reign. As the sun continued breaking fully through the dispersing clouds, casting warm, golden light across the ancient stones of the Black Citadel, for what felt like the first time in living memory, Alira allowed herself, finally, to believe that the nightmare, which had claimed 9 lives before hers, had truly ended. And that whatever came next for her and Kale, they would face it not as king and doomed bride bound by ancient obligation, but as 2 people who had chosen each other, freely and completely, and had proven, together, that even a history built on broken promises could ultimately be rebuilt into something genuine, lasting, and finally, blessedly free. The days following the trial brought a strange, unfamiliar peace to the Black Citadel, though peace, Alira quickly learned, did not mean the absence of difficult work still waiting to be done. With the ancient presence finally released and Celine's grief finally settled, the fortress itself seemed lighter somehow, the perpetual chill that had haunted its corridors for generations finally beginning to fade, replaced by ordinary warmth and ordinary sunlight streaming through windows that had rarely felt welcoming before. But Alden Marsh still waited in the lower cells, and Cale had made clear that justice for his decades of hidden betrayal could not simply be forgotten, now that the immediate crisis had passed. Elira accompanied Cale to the council chamber 3 days after the trial, where the full council, including a visibly shaken Bastian Crane, gathered to determine how the former chief advisor's punishment would be handled. "He is responsible for 9 deaths," Cale said, his voice carrying the weight of a king who had spent years grieving losses he now understood had been unnecessarily prolonged through deliberate manipulation. Not through his own hand directly, but through knowing betrayal, through choosing his own influence over the lives of women who trusted this house to protect them. Bastian rose slowly from his seat, his expression carrying deep, visible remorse. "Your Majesty, I owe you and Miss Voss an apology as well. My own counsel toward caution and distance, offered in what I believed was genuine concern, only played into the very pattern Alden was exploiting. I should have questioned his guidance more carefully over the years, rather than trusting it so completely." "You were grieving honestly," Cale said, his tone softening slightly toward the older man. "There is a difference between honest grief that leads to mistaken caution and deliberate betrayal for personal gain. I do not hold your counsel against you, Bastian, though I hope you will help me now, more actively, in rebuilding what this council should have been all along." The council debated for the better part of the afternoon, weighing the severity of Alden's betrayal against decades of otherwise loyal service, before finally settling on a sentence that stripped him of all rank, title, and property, and exiled him permanently from Blackmore Ridge territory, forbidden ever to return, under threat of far harsher punishment. Some among the council argued for more severe consequences, but Cale, exhausted by cycles of grief and retribution, ultimately favored exile over execution, wanting the new chapter of his reign to begin with something other than more bloodshed. "You are more merciful than I deserve," Alden said quietly, when Cale delivered the sentence to him personally in the lower cells, Elira standing silently beside him for the exchange. "I am not offering mercy for your sake," Cale said coldly. "I am offering it because I refuse to let your betrayal define how I choose to rule going forward. Leave this territory by dawn, and never return." As guards led the broken, defeated man away to prepare for his exile, Elira felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering anger settle in her chest. Justice, she understood, rarely felt as satisfying in reality as it did in the abstract, but watching Cale choose restraint over vengeance, choose to build something new rather than simply punishing the old, told her more about the kind of king, and the kind of partner, he intended to become, than any grand declaration could have managed. That evening, word arrived from the border territories that threatened to complicate the fragile peace they had only just begun to enjoy. A neighboring pack, led by a rival alpha named Garrick Thorne, had apparently learned of the chaos within the Black Citadel over recent weeks, the departure of the chief advisor, the unusual absence of the king during his journey north, the visible upheaval among the staff following the final trial, and had begun making aggressive moves along the shared border, testing the strength of Blackmore Ridge's defenses in ways that suggested he believed the kingdom vulnerable to challenge. "Thorne has always resented our territory's claim over the northern trade routes," Cale explained to Elira later that night, spreading a map across the study table, his expression tense with renewed concern, despite the relief of the presence's departure. "He has waited years for an opportunity to press his advantage. It seems recent events have convinced him that opportunity has finally arrived." "What does he want?" Elira asked, studying the map carefully, noting the border territories marked in tense red ink. "Control over the trade routes, certainly. Possibly more, if he believes the throne weak enough to challenge directly." Cale's jaw tightened. "I cannot allow him to believe that weakness, Elira. Not now, when this kingdom has finally begun healing from decades of hidden grief and betrayal." "Then we need to respond carefully," Elira said, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Not simply with military strength, though that may ultimately be necessary, but with a clear demonstration that this throne is stronger now than it has been in generations, precisely because the internal weakness Thorne is counting on no longer exists." Cale looked at her with something like surprised admiration. "You think like a strategist." "I think like someone who does not want to lose everything we just fought so hard to build," Illyra said firmly. Let me help you plan the response, Kale. I have earned that much, I think, after everything we have survived together already. Over the following days, Illyra found herself drawn increasingly into the practical business of ruling alongside Kale, sitting in on council meetings, offering perspectives that the assembled advisors, accustomed to a king who ruled largely through solitary grief and careful distance, found unexpectedly valuable. Bastian, in particular, seemed to warm considerably to her presence, his earlier caution giving way to genuine respect as he watched her navigate complex political questions with a clarity that came from having nothing to prove and everything to lose. You have a gift for this, Bastian told her privately, following one particularly tense council session focused on Thorne's escalating border provocations. I confess, when you first arrived, I expected another frightened girl, overwhelmed by circumstances entirely beyond her control. I did not expect someone who would help reshape this entire court so thoroughly, in such a short time. I had good reason to fight for something better, Illyra said simply. For myself, and for everyone who came before me, and never had the chance. The threat from Thorne's territory continued escalating over the following week, small border skirmishes testing Blackmore Ridge's defenses with increasing boldness, and Kale grew visibly tense with the mounting pressure, torn between his desire to remain close to Illyra, to continue building the fragile new peace they had only just secured within the citadel itself, and his responsibility to address a growing external threat before it could develop into something far more dangerous for the entire territory. I need to travel to the border myself, Kale told her one evening, his expression heavy with reluctance. Thorne needs to see, directly, that the throne remains strong, and that recent internal troubles have not weakened Blackmore Ridge's resolve. I do not wish to leave you again so soon, Illyra, especially not after everything we have just survived together. Then take me with you, Illyra said immediately. Kale hesitated, old protective instincts clearly warring with the newer understanding he had gained about the dangers of keeping her at a careful, fearful distance. The border is dangerous, Illyra. Not the same danger we have already faced together, but a very real, very physical danger nonetheless. I did not survive being lifted into the sky by an ancient, grieving presence, only to be left behind now, worrying uselessly in the citadel, while you face down a rival alpha alone, Illyra said firmly. We agreed, Kale, no more retreating from each other out of fear. That promise did not end simply because the immediate crisis with the presence has passed. Something in Kale's expression softened, a small, tired smile finally breaking through his tension. No, he admitted. I suppose it did not. Very well. We travel to the border together, and we face whatever Thorne intends together, exactly as we have faced everything else. As preparations began for their journey toward the increasingly tense northern border, Illyra found herself reflecting on how much had changed since the terrified morning when the selection bell had first rung in her small village square. She had arrived at the Black Citadel expecting only fear and likely tragedy, and instead had found genuine partnership, hard-won trust, and a purpose far larger than simple survival. Whatever waited for them at the border, whatever challenge Garrick Thorne intended to press against a throne he believed weakened, Illyra understood now, with quiet, steady certainty, that she and Kale would face it exactly as they had faced everything before, together, honestly, and without the fear that had once threatened to keep them permanently apart. The journey toward the northern border took 2 full days of steady riding, the landscape gradually shifting from the familiar mountains surrounding the citadel into rougher, more contested territory, where the boundary between Blackmore Ridge and Thorne's lands had never been entirely settled, even generations ago. Illyra rode close beside Kale for most of the journey, Roan and a full contingent of guards flanking them protectively, and she found herself studying the passing landscape with a new, careful attention, noting the small villages they passed, the wary expressions of border residents accustomed to living beneath the shadow of ongoing tension between 2 rival packs. These people have lived with this uncertainty their whole lives, Kale said quietly, following her gaze toward a small farming settlement they passed, its residents watching the royal procession with cautious, guarded curiosity. My father fought 2 separate conflicts with Thorne's predecessor over these same trade routes. I had hoped, when I took the throne, that I might finally secure a lasting peace instead. It seems that hope may have been premature. Perhaps not, Illyra said thoughtfully. Perhaps this is simply another chance to build something more lasting than what came before, the same way we built something more lasting within the citadel itself. They arrived at the border outpost late on the second day, greeted by the local garrison commander, a weathered woman named Freya, who had spent decades defending this particular stretch of contested territory. Her report confirmed what they had already suspected, that Thorn's forces had grown increasingly bold over recent weeks, probing the border defenses with small, deliberate incursions, clearly designed to test Blackmore Ridge's response, rather than launch any serious invasion attempt outright. "He wants to see how we react," Cale said, studying the maps Freya had prepared, showing the pattern of recent incursions along the border. "He is testing whether the throne remains strong enough to respond decisively, or whether internal troubles have left us too distracted to properly defend our own territory. Then we need to respond in a way that leaves no doubt," Elira said, an idea beginning to form as she studied the map more closely. "Not through aggressive military escalation, which risks exactly the kind of prolonged conflict your father fought twice already, but through a direct, confident demonstration of strength and unity that makes further testing pointless." "What do you have in mind?" Cale asked, curiosity evident in his voice. "A formal meeting," Elira said. "Request a direct audience with Thorn himself, here at the border, rather than continuing this pattern of small skirmishes and probing incursions. Bring your full counsel, bring your strength, and bring me, standing beside you as your chosen partner, healthy and strong, proof beyond any doubt that whatever internal troubles Thorn believes he detected have already been resolved, decisively and completely." Cale considered this carefully, and Freya, listening from nearby, nodded slowly in agreement. "It is a bold approach, Your Majesty, but I believe Miss Voss may be right. Thorn respects strength and directness far more than he respects prolonged uncertainty. A direct challenge, offered confidently, may accomplish more than weeks of continued border skirmishes ever could." The request for a formal meeting was sent the following morning, and Thorn's response arrived within hours, agreeing to a meeting at the border's central crossing point, though his message carried an unmistakable edge of challenge, suggesting he anticipated an opportunity to press his advantage directly, rather than genuinely seeking peaceful resolution. The meeting itself, when it finally occurred 2 days later, unfolded beneath a tense, overcast sky, both parties arriving with substantial escorts, though careful diplomatic protocol kept actual weapons sheathed and hostility contained to pointed words rather than open conflict. Garrick Thorn proved to be a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating eyes, his expression carrying the confident swagger of someone who believed he already held the advantage in whatever negotiation followed. "Cale Draven," Thorn said, his tone carrying deliberate, provocative casualness. "I had heard troubling rumors about chaos within your citadel, advisors fleeing in disgrace, mysterious absences, unexplained upheaval among your staff. I confess, I expected to find a king far more weakened than the one standing before me now. Rumors, as you have discovered, rarely tell the full story," Cale said, his voice carrying calm, unshakable authority that Elira found herself admiring, even as tension coiled tight in her own chest. "Whatever internal matters required my attention have been fully resolved, Garrick. Blackmore Ridge stands stronger now than it has in generations, and I would advise you to reconsider whatever advantage you believed recent events might have offered you." Thorn's eyes flicked toward Elira, assessing her with open, calculating curiosity. "And this must be your 10th bride. I confess, I did not expect her to still be standing here, healthy and strong, given the history of your previous unions." "Elira Voss is not simply my bride," Cale said, his voice carrying a fierce pride that sent warmth spreading through Elira's chest, despite the tension of the confrontation. "She is my chosen partner, and the reason this throne now stands freed from a burden that has weakened every king before me. I would think carefully, Garrick, before assuming weakness where genuine strength has, in fact, only just been secured." The negotiation that followed stretched over several tense hours, Thorn testing the boundaries of Cale's resolve with pointed questions and thinly veiled threats, while Cale, with Elira's steady presence beside him and careful counsel, offered quietly between exchanges, held firm without escalating toward outright conflict. By the meeting's conclusion, Thorn, though clearly reluctant to fully abandon his earlier ambitions, agreed to withdraw his forces from the contested border incursions, at least for the time being, recognizing, Elira suspected, that whatever weakness he had hoped to exploit no longer existed in any meaningful form. As they rode back toward the border outpost following the successful negotiation, Cale reached for Alira's hand, his expression carrying visible relief and renewed respect. "You were right," he said. A direct, confident response accomplished more than weeks of continued conflict ever could have managed. "We accomplished it together," Alira corrected gently. "Exactly as we have accomplished everything else since I arrived at your citadel." As the border outpost came back into view, its watchtowers standing steady against the gradually clearing sky, Alira allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, understanding that the threat from Thorn's territory, while perhaps not permanently resolved, had at least been contained through careful strategy, rather than costly conflict. But even as relief settled over her, a small, persistent unease remained at the edges of her thoughts, a sense that their victory over external threats and internal betrayal alike had perhaps been achieved too easily, too completely, and that somewhere, waiting quietly in the shadows of a kingdom only beginning to heal, one final challenge might still remain before their story could truly reach its rightful, well-earned conclusion. The unease that had settled over Alira during their ride back from the border proved within days to be entirely justified. They had barely returned to the Black Citadel, barely begun settling back into the gentler rhythm of their newly healing home, when Roan arrived at the study one afternoon, with an expression grim enough to immediately silence the quiet conversation Alira and Cale had been sharing over afternoon tea. "Your Majesty, we have received word from the exile patrol assigned to escort Alden Marsh from the territory," Roan said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. He never reached the southern border crossing as required by his sentence. The patrol found signs of a struggle near the crossing, but no trace of Alden himself, alive or otherwise. Cale's expression darkened immediately. "You believe someone intercepted him? Or he arranged his own disappearance," Roan said grimly. "Either possibility concerns me greatly, Your Majesty." Alira felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, the fragile peace they had only just begun to enjoy, suddenly feeling far more precarious than it had only moments before. "Do you think he could still pose a danger, even without his position or the stolen stone we recovered from him?" "I do not know," Cale admitted, "but a man who spent decades manipulating an ancient, dangerous presence for his own gain, and who clearly possessed knowledge and resources far beyond what his official position alone would suggest, should not be underestimated simply because he has lost his formal title." Over the following days, Roan's investigation into Alden's disappearance uncovered troubling details that only deepened their concern. Records recovered from the former advisor's private quarters revealed correspondence with several individuals across the wider territory, hints of resources and alliances built quietly over years that extended well beyond his official duties at the Citadel. Most concerning of all, a final entry in his private journal, dated only days before his exile, spoke of contingency plans should his position at court ever be threatened, referencing something called the second binding that none of them had yet encountered in any of their previous research. "A second binding," Marguerite said thoughtfully, when Cale summoned her back to the Citadel to help interpret the troubling reference. "I have never heard my family speak of such a thing. Celine's original binding was singular, tied directly to the selection and the presence you have already faced and released. Could Alden have created something new himself?" Alira asked. "Using what he learned from studying the original binding over the years?" Marguerite's expression grew troubled. "It is possible, though such a thing would require power and knowledge far beyond what an ordinary advisor should have possessed, even one who spent years studying ancient magic in secret. If he has genuinely created something new, something separate from my grandmother's original grief, then we may be facing a danger none of us fully understand yet." The warning proved prophetic sooner than any of them anticipated. 10 days after Alden's disappearance, disturbing reports began arriving from villages scattered across Blackmore Ridge's southern territories, accounts of strange, aggressive shadow creatures appearing at night, smaller and less powerful than the presence they had faced within the Citadel, but numerous and increasingly bold, attacking livestock, damaging property, and in several deeply troubling cases, injuring villagers who crossed their path. "These are not natural creatures," Cale said grimly, studying the reports Roan had gathered from the affected villages, "and the timing cannot be coincidence." "Alden," Alira said, cold certainty settling over her, He must have found a way to create or summon these creatures, perhaps using knowledge he gathered while studying Celine's original binding. They traveled to the most severely affected village personally, wanting to assess the danger directly, rather than relying solely on second-hand reports, and what they found upon arrival confirmed their worst fears. The shadow creatures, when Roan's scouts finally managed to track one down and observe it directly, bore an unmistakable resemblance to smaller, weaker fragments of the presence that had once haunted the citadel, as though something had deliberately splintered off pieces of that ancient power and set them loose upon the countryside. "He is doing this deliberately," Cale said, fury and concern warring visibly across his features as they reviewed the scouts' reports together that evening. "Punishing this territory, and by extension punishing us, for stripping him of the position and influence he spent decades building. Or perhaps demonstrating that he still holds power we have not yet accounted for," Illyra suggested. "A warning, of sorts, that our victory over him was not as complete as we believed." The following weeks brought increasing pressure as the shadow creature attacks spread across a wider stretch of southern territory, forcing Cale to divide his attention between managing the growing crisis and maintaining the delicate peace they had only just secured along the northern border with Thorn's territory. Illyra found herself working tirelessly alongside him, coordinating with village leaders, organizing protective measures for the most vulnerable settlements, and continuing her own research alongside Marguerite into the nature of this troubling second binding Alden appeared to have created. "There is a pattern to the attacks," Illyra observed one evening, spreading a map covered in careful notation across the study table, marking each reported incident with a small red symbol. "They are moving steadily northward, toward the citadel itself, growing slightly stronger and more numerous with each new report." Marguerite leaned over the map, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she traced the pattern Illyra had identified. "If this trend continues, whatever Alden has created may eventually converge directly on this fortress. Perhaps that has been his intention from the very beginning, a slow, escalating assault designed to weaken and demoralize before some larger, final confrontation. Then we cannot simply wait for that confrontation to arrive on its own terms," Cale said firmly. "We need to find Alden directly and put an end to whatever he has set in motion before it grows any stronger." Locating Alden proved far more difficult than any of them anticipated, the former advisor having clearly gone to considerable lengths to hide his trail following his staged disappearance. It was ultimately Bastian, drawing on decades of accumulated knowledge about the Citadel's history and Alden's own long tenure at court, who finally identified a possible location, an old, abandoned watchtower in the southern hills that had once served as a minor outpost before falling into disuse generations earlier. Situated, Illyra noted with grim recognition, almost precisely at the center point of the expanding pattern of shadow creature attacks. They approached the watchtower carefully, under cover of early morning darkness. Cale, Illyra, Roan, Marguerite, and a small contingent of trusted guards, moving quietly through the surrounding hills, to avoid alerting whatever defenses Alden might have prepared. As they drew closer, the air itself seemed to grow heavier, colder, carrying the same unsettling wrongness Illyra remembered from her encounters with the original presence, though this felt somehow less ancient, more raw and unstable, as though whatever power Alden had gathered here remained fundamentally unfinished, dangerously unpredictable. They found him inside the crumbling watchtower's central chamber, surrounded by an elaborate arrangement of symbols drawn in some dark substance across the stone floor, muttering words in a language Illyra did not recognize, while shadow creatures, dozens of them, writhed and pulsed within a swirling vortex of darkness he appeared to be actively summoning and directing from the chamber's center. "Alden," Cale said, his voice carrying cold, controlled fury as he stepped into the chamber, weapon drawn, Illyra and the others fanning out carefully behind him. "This ends now." Alden turned toward them, his once carefully composed features now gaunt and wild, his eyes carrying a feverish intensity that spoke of weeks spent pushing himself far beyond safe limits in pursuit of whatever power he believed this ritual would grant him. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice rough and strained. "I have found a way to reclaim what you took from me, a binding of my own, built from the fragments of Celine's original power that I studied so carefully over the years." "You are destroying innocent lives," Illyra said sharply, stepping forward despite Kale's instinctive protective movement to keep her behind him. Villagers, who have nothing to do with your grievances against the throne. Collateral consequence, Alden said, something unhinged flickering across his expression. Once this binding fully matures, once I have gathered sufficient power, I will finally hold the influence necessary to reclaim my rightful position, whether this throne welcomes my return or not. There will be no return for you, Kale said firmly. Only justice, this time carried out fully, rather than tempered by the mercy I mistakenly extended before. As Kale moved forward, intent on stopping the ritual before it could progress any further, Alden gestured sharply, and several of the shadow creatures surged out from the swirling vortex, moving to intercept with startling speed and aggression. The chamber erupted into chaos, guards moving to engage the attacking creatures, while Marguerite began chanting counterwords she had clearly prepared in advance, working to disrupt the unstable binding Alden had constructed. Elira found herself facing one of the creatures directly, its formless shadow body lunging toward her with claws that felt disturbingly solid despite their immaterial appearance. She dodged instinctively, remembering the basic defensive movements Kale had taught her in the training yard weeks earlier, and managed to avoid the worst of the attack, though the creature's passing form left an icy trail of pain across her forearm. Across the chamber, Kale fought his way steadily toward Alden himself, cutting through the chaos with focused, determined purpose, while Roan and the guards worked to contain the remaining creatures and protect Marguerite as she continued her disruptive counter-ritual. The battle felt endless, chaotic, shadow and steel clashing within the crumbling stone chamber, but gradually, as Marguerite's counterwords took effect, and Kale finally closed the distance to Alden himself, the tide began shifting decisively in their favor. "It's unraveling," Marguerite called out, her voice strained with effort, as the swirling vortex at the chamber's center began visibly destabilizing, the shadow creatures still active in the room, growing weaker, less coordinated, as their connection to Alden's incomplete binding faltered. "Finish it now, before it collapses entirely, and takes something else down with it." Kale reached Alden just as the former advisor, sensing his ritual's imminent failure, attempted a final, desperate lunge, and in the brief, brutal struggle that followed, Kale managed to disarm him completely, pinning him firmly against the crumbling stone wall of the chamber, as the vortex behind them finally collapsed entirely, the remaining shadow creatures dissolving into nothing as their unstable source of power disappeared. "It's over, Alden," Kale said, breathing hard, his voice carrying both exhaustion and unshakable resolve. "Whatever twisted ambition drove you to this, it ends here, permanently." Alden slumped against the wall, all remaining fight finally draining from him, his eyes carrying a hollow, defeated emptiness that spoke of everything he had sacrificed in pursuit of power that had ultimately proven both unstable and entirely futile. "I only wanted to matter," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "After decades of quiet influence, I could not bear becoming irrelevant." "You mattered when you served honestly," Kale said, his voice carrying a weary sadness beneath its firmness. "You destroyed that yourself, through choices that were entirely your own." As guards moved forward to secure Alden properly this time, ensuring no further opportunity for escape or manipulation, Elira crossed the chamber to stand beside Kale, her injured arm throbbing but far from serious, relief flooding through her as she surveyed the now quiet, empty chamber, where such dangerous chaos had reigned only minutes before. "It's truly finished now," she said softly, leaning into Kale's side, as he wrapped a protective, exhausted arm around her shoulders. "Truly finished," Kale agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, his relief evident in every line of his tired but steady voice. "No more hidden threats, no more ancient grief, no more desperate men seeking power through stolen fragments of a curse that should have ended generations ago. Whatever comes next for this kingdom, Elira, I believe we finally face it with nothing standing between us and the future we have fought so hard to build." As they made their way out of the crumbling watchtower and back toward the waiting horses, the first light of true dawn finally breaking clear and warm across the southern hills, Elira allowed herself, at last, to fully believe that the long, difficult trial which had begun with a terrifying scroll read aloud in her village square had finally, completely, reached its end. The journey back to the citadel felt different from any of their previous travels together, the weight of genuine, complete victory settling over their small party in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after so many weeks of accumulated tension and danger. Marguerite rode close beside Alira for much of the return trip, her expression carrying a peaceful contentment that Alira suspected had been absent from her life for a very long time. "My grandmother's grandmother can finally rest fully now," Marguerite said, as the citadel's dark towers came back into view against the clearing sky. Not only was her original binding satisfied honestly, but the corrupted fragment of it, twisted by a man seeking only selfish power, has now been destroyed as well. I did not expect, when I agreed to help you both, that we would need to face 2 separate trials before this history could finally be laid to rest completely. Neither did we, Alira admitted, glancing toward Cale, who rode a short distance ahead, deep in quiet conversation with Roan about the practical matters of securing Alden properly and beginning the process of repairing the damage his creatures had caused across the affected villages. "But I am grateful you were willing to help us through both, Marguerite. This kingdom owes your family a debt that I do not think can ever be fully repaid." Seeing genuine loyalty finally honored, after generations of watching this bloodline fail that same test again and again, is repayment enough, Marguerite said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her usual careful composure. "I believe my grandmother would be satisfied, watching you both now." Upon their return to the Citadel, the following weeks brought the practical, unglamorous work of recovery, rebuilding damaged villages in the southern territories, compensating families who had lost livestock or property to Alden's shadow creatures, and slowly, carefully, restoring the kind of stable, trusted governance that Blackmore Ridge had lacked for far too many years, beneath the weight of hidden manipulation and unresolved ancient grief. Alira threw herself fully into this recovery work, alongside Cale, and found, as the weeks passed, that the council and staff who had once regarded her with cautious uncertainty now looked to her with growing genuine respect, recognizing in her someone who had not only survived the trials that claimed 9 women before her, but who had actively fought, again and again, to build something better in their place. Bastian, in particular, became one of her closest allies within the council chamber. His earlier grief-driven caution transformed now into genuine, active partnership as they worked together to rebuild trust between the throne and the wider territory's scattered villages. "I confess," he told her one evening, following a particularly productive council session focused on rebuilding the southern settlements, "when you first arrived at this citadel, I expected to eventually mourn you, as I mourned the 9 before you. I find myself, instead, deeply grateful to have been proven so thoroughly wrong." "We were all fighting against a history that should have ended generations ago," Alira said. "I am simply glad we finally found a way to end it properly, together." Alden himself remained held in the lower cells, awaiting a fuller reckoning that Cale, this time, showed no inclination toward tempering with the same mercy he had originally extended. The full council, presented with clear evidence of his renewed betrayal, his creation of dangerous shadow creatures that had directly harmed innocent villagers, unanimously supported a far harsher judgment than his initial exile, and Alden Marsh ultimately faced permanent imprisonment deep within the Citadel's most secure holdings, his ambitions for power finally, completely extinguished. As the southern villages slowly recovered from the disruption Alden's creatures had caused, and as the northern border with Thorn's territory settled into a wary but genuine peace following their earlier successful negotiation, Alira found herself, for the first time since the terrifying morning the selection bell had rung in her home village, able to simply breathe, to exist within the Black Citadel, not as a frightened bride awaiting inevitable tragedy, but as someone who had genuinely earned her place within these ancient walls, through courage, persistence, and a willingness to face every danger honestly, rather than retreating into fear. One evening, as autumn began settling gently over the mountains surrounding the Citadel, painting the surrounding forests in warm shades of gold and deep red, Cale found her once again in the eastern gardens, beneath his mother's flowering tree, now bare of blossoms but still standing strong and steady against the changing season. "I have been thinking," he said, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench, "about everything that brought us here. The selection bell, the archive, Celine's grief, Alden's betrayal, Thorn's challenge, and finally, this last desperate attempt at power that very nearly cost us everything we had built. I find myself wondering, Now that it has all finally settled, what comes next for us? What do you want to come next? Illyra asked, watching him carefully. Chaol turned to face her fully, his dark eyes carrying an openness and warmth that felt, in this quiet moment, entirely different from the guarded, grieving king, who had first greeted her at the top of the Citadel's entrance stairs so many weeks earlier. I want a life built on exactly what we fought so hard to prove, Illyra. Genuine loyalty, freely chosen, day after day, not because ancient obligation demands it, but because it is truly what I want, more than anything else this crown could ever offer me. Illyra felt her heart swell with an emotion so full it nearly overwhelmed her, understanding exactly what he was suggesting even before he continued speaking. I want that too, she said softly. I want to build a life here, with you, not as the 10th bride who finally survived, but simply as Illyra, choosing you, every single day, exactly as you have chosen me. As the last golden light of sunset filtered gently through the bare branches above them, Chaol reached for her hand, holding it steadily in his own, and Illyra understood, with a certainty that felt as solid and enduring as the ancient mountains surrounding them, that whatever challenges still waited in their future, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything already, together, honestly, and with a loyalty finally, fully proven beyond any doubt. Word of the Citadel's transformation spread slowly across Blackmore Ridge territory throughout the following months, carried village to village by travelers and traders, who spoke, with growing wonder, of a king who no longer ruled from behind walls of grief and careful distance, and of a queen, though she had not yet formally claimed that title, who had somehow survived where 9 women before her had tragically failed, and who now stood visibly, publicly, beside her king in matters of governance and daily life alike. Illyra received word from her family regularly now, Chaol having personally ensured that messengers traveled safely and swiftly between the Citadel and her small home village, and she learned, with deep relief, that her parents and sister had weathered the months of her absence with cautious hope, rather than the despair they might once have expected to feel. When she finally arranged for them to visit the Citadel directly, several months after the trials had concluded, the reunion brought tears and laughter in equal measure, her mother clutching her tightly enough to nearly steal her breath, her father's stern composure finally cracking into open, relieved emotion, and Nora, taller now than when Illyra had last seen her, hugging her sister with the fierce, uncomplicated joy of someone who had genuinely feared she might never see her again. You look different, Nora said, studying Illyra carefully, once the initial flood of emotion had settled into quieter conversation. Stronger, somehow. I have been through a great deal, Illyra admitted, smiling, as she watched her sister take in the grandeur of the Citadel's main hall, with wide, curious eyes. But I have also found something I never expected to find here. A partner who chose to fight alongside me, rather than simply waiting to see whether I would survive. Chaol greeted her family with genuine warmth, far removed from the distant, formal courtesy that tradition might have suggested was appropriate between a king and the humble family of his chosen partner. He spent an entire afternoon walking the grounds with Edwin Voss, discussing, Illyra later learned with amused affection, matters as simple and ordinary as woodworking techniques and the best methods for maintaining healthy timber stock, treating her father's practical knowledge with genuine respect, rather than the dismissive courtesy a king might have offered a lowly woodcutter under different circumstances. He is a good man, her father told her privately, before her family's visit finally concluded and they prepared to return to their village, though now with Chaol's promise of continued support and protection, extended formally to their entire household. I was terrified, Illyra, when your name was called that morning. I want you to know that watching you now, seeing the life you have built here, seeing the man who stands beside you, has eased a fear I did not believe could ever fully leave me. I am glad, Illyra said, embracing her father tightly. I promised Nora I would find a way through this. I am glad I was able to keep that promise, and to bring something good out of it besides. As autumn deepened into winter, and the Citadel settled into its first truly peaceful season, in longer than anyone among its staff could clearly remember, Chaol began quietly preparing for a formal coronation ceremony, one that would finally, publicly declare Illyra, not simply as his chosen bride, but as his queen, ruling equally beside him, rather than existing merely as a survivor of ancient tradition. The preparations brought their own gentle chaos to the Citadel. staff bustling with excitement, rather than the fearful uncertainty that had once characterized every previous bride's tenure within these walls. And Alira found herself swept up in decisions about ceremony and celebration that felt, after everything else she had survived, almost pleasantly overwhelming in their ordinary complexity. Marguerite returned to the citadel for the coronation itself, along with several members of her small hidden settlement, marking the first time in generations that descendants of Celine's coven had openly, publicly returned to the very fortress their ancestor had once cursed so thoroughly. Their presence, Cale insisted, was essential, a visible symbol of the reconciliation and healing that had finally been achieved between two peoples separated for so long by broken promises and unresolved grief. Your grandmother's grandmother would be proud to see this day, Alira told Marguerite quietly, as they stood together in the citadel's main hall, watching final preparations unfold around them in the hours before the ceremony was set to begin. I believe she would be, Marguerite agreed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Though I suspect she would be equally proud of you, Alira Voss, for refusing to simply accept the fate handed to you, and for fighting so persistently to prove that trust broken generations ago could, in fact, still be rebuilt. The coronation ceremony itself unfolded beneath a clear winter sky, snow dusting the surrounding mountains in soft white. The citadel's courtyard transformed with warm lanterns and gathered well-wishers from across the territory, villagers who had traveled considerable distances simply to witness the moment when the 10th bride, the one who had finally survived where 9 before her had tragically failed, was formally crowned Queen of Blackmore Ridge. Alira stood before the assembled crowd in a gown of deep midnight blue, embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the lantern light beautifully, and as Cale placed the ceremonial crown gently upon her head, his eyes carrying an emotion so open and genuine that it brought tears to her own eyes despite her best efforts to maintain composure befitting the occasion, she felt the full weight of everything they had survived together, finally settling into something that felt, at last, entirely and completely earned. People of Blackmore Ridge, Cale announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed, attentive courtyard. For too many generations, this throne has been shadowed by grief, by broken promises, and by tragedies that claimed far too many lives before their time. Today, I stand before you not simply to crown my queen, but to declare, publicly and permanently, that this house has finally, fully honored the trust it once so carelessly broke. Alira Voss did not simply survive the trials placed before her. She fought, again and again, to build something genuine, something lasting, and in doing so, she has freed this entire bloodline from a burden that shaped every king before me. The crowd's response rose in a wave of genuine, joyful celebration, cheers and applause echoing across the courtyard and out over the surrounding mountains, and Alira, standing beside Cale with the weight of the ceremonial crown settling gently upon her, felt, for the first time since the terrifying morning the selection bell had first rung in her small village square, that she had truly, completely arrived exactly where she was always meant to be. In the months and years that followed, the story of the 10th bride who survived spread far beyond the borders of Blackmore Ridge itself, becoming, in time, something closer to legend than simple history, a story told to frightened children facing uncertain futures, a reminder that courage and genuine loyalty could overcome even the most deeply entrenched cycles of grief and tragedy. Alira and Cale ruled together, with a partnership that grew steadily stronger with each passing season, their council strengthened by voices like bastions and roans, their kingdom's borders secured through careful diplomacy rather than costly, prolonged conflict, and their bond with Marguerite's people restored into something that finally honored the trust Celine had once, so long ago, believed impossible to rebuild. Alden Marsh remained held within the citadel's secure holdings for the remainder of his days, a quiet, permanent reminder of what selfish ambition could ultimately cost, even the most carefully cultivated position of trust and influence. Garrick Thorne, watching Blackmore Ridge continue strengthening steadily under its newly unified leadership, eventually abandoned his earlier ambitions entirely, settling into a wary but genuinely respectful peace that endured for the remainder of both rulers' lifetimes. And within the ancient black walls of the citadel itself, walls that had once echoed with generations of unresolved grief and quiet, desperate fear, laughter became, gradually and genuinely, a far more common sound than sorrow, children's voices eventually joining that laughter as well. Born into a bloodline finally, completely freed from the shadow that had claimed 9 lives before their mother had arrived, determined and unafraid, to finally break a cycle that had waited far too long for someone brave enough to face it honestly. Alira Voss, once simply a frightened village girl whose name had been called by a terrible scroll on an ordinary morning, became, in time, remembered not as the 10th tragedy in a long and grieving history, but as the woman who finally, completely changed that history forever, proving, beyond any doubt, that even the deepest wounds of broken trust could ultimately be healed, given enough courage, enough honesty, and enough genuine, freely chosen loyalty to see the difficult work through to its rightful, hard-won end. Years later, on a quiet spring afternoon, much like the ones that had once drawn Alira toward the eastern gardens during those early, uncertain days of her arrival at the Citadel, she found herself sitting beneath the same flowering tree, now surrounded by new blossoms each season, watching her 2 young children chase each other happily across the grass, while Kale looked on with the kind of open, unguarded contentment that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first tense weeks of their fragile, uncertain beginning. Their eldest, a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady, watchful eyes, paused in his play to ask, as children often did, about the old stories he had heard whispered among the Citadel staff, stories of shadows and ancient grief, and a curse that had once claimed 9 women before his mother finally broke its terrible pattern. "Is it true, Mother?" he asked, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench, his expression carrying the earnest curiosity of a child who had grown up entirely free from the fear that had once haunted these very halls. "Were you really the 10th bride who survived?" Alira smiled, reaching to smooth his dark hair gently, and glanced toward Kale, who had settled on her other side, his hand finding hers in the same steady, familiar gesture that had carried them both through so many difficult trials in the years before their children's happy laughter had become the Citadel's most common sound. "I was," she confirmed gently. "But surviving was never truly the most important part of that story, my love. What mattered most was choosing to fight for something better, even when every reason in the world suggested that fighting would only end in tragedy, exactly as it had for the 9 women who came before me. And you chose father," her son said, glancing curiously between his parents. "I chose your father," Alira agreed, meeting Kale's warm, steady gaze over their son's head. Freely, completely, and without the fear that had kept so many others from ever truly finding each other before us. That choice, made honestly and renewed every single day since, is what finally set this entire house free. Their daughter, younger and still more interested in chasing butterflies through the garden than in old family history, called out happily from across the grass, and their son, satisfied with his mother's answer, soon abandoned the conversation to rejoin his sister's game, leaving Alira and Kale alone, once more beneath the flowering branches that had witnessed so much of their shared history unfold. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Kale asked quietly, watching their children play in the golden afternoon light. "When I met you at the top of those stairs, certain I was about to watch history repeat itself yet again." "Often," Alira admitted, leaning into his familiar, steady presence. "I think about how frightened I was, and how determined, both at once. I think about Greta's warnings, and Roan's careful honesty, and the sealed door in the archive that started everything. I think about how close we came to losing everything, more than once, and how grateful I am, every single day, that we chose to face all of it honestly, together, rather than allowing fear to keep us apart." "I am grateful as well," Kale said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "More grateful than I could ever properly express, for a 10th bride who refused to simply accept the fate handed to her, and who taught an entire bloodline, finally, what genuine loyalty could truly accomplish." As the afternoon light gradually softened toward evening, and their children's laughter continued echoing warmly across gardens that had once stood silent beneath generations of unresolved grief, Alira allowed herself, as she often did in these quiet, peaceful moments, to simply be grateful for the extraordinary, difficult, ultimately triumphant journey that had brought her here. From a terrified girl standing frozen in her village square as a herald read her name aloud, to a queen sitting contentedly beneath a flowering tree, surrounded by a family and a peace that 9 women before her had never lived long enough to witness. The Black Citadel, once a fortress synonymous with tragedy and quiet, desperate fear, had become instead a place of genuine warmth and lasting hope, its ancient stones no longer echoing with unresolved grief, but standing instead as steady, enduring proof that even the deepest wounds of broken trust could, given enough courage and enough honest, freely chosen loyalty, ultimately find their way toward healing, toward peace, and toward a happiness that had waited far, far too long to finally, completely arrive. And so it was that Elira Voss, the 10th bride who was never meant to survive, became instead the queen who finally, permanently changed everything, her story carried forward, not as a tale of narrow escape from tragedy, but as a lasting testament to what genuine, unwavering loyalty could accomplish. Even against odds that had claimed 9 lives before hers, even against a history built on broken promises and generations of unresolved grief, and even against a curse that had waited far too long for someone brave enough and honest enough to finally, completely break it for good.